Hello there, and welcome to the natural Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're traveling backward in time, far beyond recorded history, beyond the first forests, beyond the age of dinosaurs, even beyond the first creatures that dared to walk on land. We're going to a quieter, older chapter of Earth's story, a time when the seas shimmered with strange new life, and the continents were bare, rocky, and waiting for something miraculous to happen. This was the Silurian Period, a forgotten age when the planet began to turn green for the first time. Before we begin, I wonder where you're listening from tonight. Maybe your room is dim. Maybe you can hear the soft hum of a streetlight or the slow rhythm of your own breath. Wherever you are, know that the ground beneath you, the hills outside your city, the stones that build your home, they all carry the silent memory of this ancient world. Once, this very place might have been under a shallow tropical sea, warm, calm, and filled with creatures that had never known a leaf or a bird or even a tree. The air then was thin and sharp, the land bare and quiet. But something extraordinary was about to change that. If you find this gentle journey soothing, or simply a peaceful way to unwind after your day, it would mean a lot if you gave this video a like or subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm reach others who might need a moment of wonder before they drift off. So, settle in, let your thoughts slow down, and imagine the world as it once was, nearly 440 million years ago, when the Earth began to breathe for the very first time. In the great sweep of geologic history, the Silurian comes after turmoil. Before it, the Ordovician period had ended in one of the most dramatic mass extinctions in Earth's past. Global ice spread from the poles, sea levels dropped, and nearly 85% of marine species vanished. Coral reefs collapsed, trilobites dwindled, and the ocean floor fell silent. And yet, as the ice melted and the planet warmed again, something remarkable happened. Life began to recover. The seas filled once more with movement, light, and color. In that renewal, a quieter revolution was beginning to take shape, one that would eventually transform every coastline, every forest, and even the air itself. If you could stand on the shore of a Silurian coastline, the first thing you'd notice is the stillness of the land. There are no trees, no grass, no rustle of leaves. The surface is made of stone, dust, and the faint shimmer of moisture from nearby waves. The horizon looks endless, a sweep of bare continents under a sun that feels harsh without the soft filter of vegetation. The air carries a sharp tang of minerals, and if you took a deep breath, though you might not want to, you'd notice how thin it feels. There's oxygen, yes, but not much. The kind of air that leaves you slightly breathless, as if the planet hasn't quite learned how to breathe deeply yet. Then, if you turned your gaze to the sea, everything would change. Beneath the waves, life has found its rhythm again. Coral reefs are rebuilding, made not of the same corals we know today, but of early relatives. Simple organisms that weave together into great undersea walls and domes. Among them, soft-bodied creatures drift and sway. The water is warm, shallow, and rich with plankton. Tiny crustaceans scuttle through clusters of algae, while early jawless fish glide like ghosts between sponges and crinoids. The world is healing from disaster, and in doing so, it's reinventing itself. Evolution, that quiet but unstoppable process, is reshaping the living world molecule by molecule. The Silurian seas are filled with species that seem both familiar and alien. The first signs of vertebrates taking on complex forms, the first hints of predators that will later dominate the oceans. Yet the real story of the Silurian is not just under the water, it's in what's happening above it, on land. Because for the first time, the edge between sea and stone begins to blur. Life, cautious and slow, is creeping out of the water. Not animals yet, but plants, small, simple, and determined. They cling to damp rocks along the shoreline, green filaments no taller than your thumb. They look fragile, But they're doing something monumental. They're learning to live without being surrounded by water. Imagine these first plants. They have no roots, no flowers, no leaves, just slender stems and tiny cells capable of photosynthesis. Each one is like a small experiment in survival. They draw moisture from the mist, soak in sunlight, and begin to exchange gases with the air. This is the moment Earth starts to change color, from gray and brown to faint patches of green, from lifeless crust to living surface. Scientists studying ancient rocks have found spores from these early plants, microscopic fossils that tell us when and where they first appeared. They show that during the Silurian, life began to spread across the land in earnest. At first, just near the coasts, then further inland, wherever there was moisture enough to sustain them. These humble pioneers paved the way for forests, for animals, for us. Without them, there would be no soil, no oxygen-rich air, no ecosystems to fill the continents. But none of this happened quickly. It took millions of years of slow, patient change. The Silurian world was not in a hurry. It had all the time it needed. The continents themselves were drifting toward each other, forming larger land masses that would one day merge into supercontinents. The climate was warm, the tides steady. The oceans wrapped around the continents like silk, carrying nutrients, oxygen, and the seeds of new life. If you could float above the Silurian Earth, you'd see a planet covered mostly by ocean, dotted with small island continents. The poles were relatively ice-free now, and the climate mild compared to the freezing ages before. You'd see the faint beginnings of a global pattern, currents moving heat from equator to pole, cycles of evaporation and rainfall shaping coastlines. The world was stabilizing, and with that stability came opportunity. Everywhere you looked underwater, life was diversifying. The first bony fish appeared, their skeletons providing strength and protection beyond what cartilage alone could manage. They weren't the sleek swimmers of modern seas, but they were adaptable. Small victories in evolution, but each one opening new possibilities. Trilobites, those enduring icons of early life, continued to thrive, scuttling across sea floors, burrowing, feeding, molting. Their hard shells recorded their growth like tree rings, each line a quiet record of survival. Above them, floating colonies of plankton transformed sunlight into energy, pumping oxygen into the water and slowly into the atmosphere. The exchange between sea and sky deepened. The planet was learning how to breathe through its oceans and its first plants, creating a feedback loop that would define life ever after. It's easy to overlook this time in Earth's story. The Silurian isn't famous like the Jurassic or dramatic like the Cretaceous. There are no towering dinosaurs, no giant ferns, no thunderous predators. But what makes it extraordinary is its subtlety. It's the age when Earth's systems, biological, chemical, geological, began to link together in new ways. It's the quiet foundation on which everything else was built. The reefs that grew during the Silurian would become limestone cliffs millions of years later. The oxygen produced by those early plants would make possible the explosions of life that followed. Even the arrangement of the continents, gently sliding toward each other, would shape the climate for eons to come. There's a certain serenity to thinking about that. The idea that the world's greatest transformations often happen quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. The Silurian was an age of restoration and renewal, and though few people ever talk about it, its legacy is everywhere, in every leaf, in every breath, in the color green itself. As we drift deeper into this journey through time, we'll see how the calm after catastrophe became a canvas for life to paint again. How the seas recovered, how coral gardens bloomed, and how from that calm, a new kind of world began to rise. And so, as you listen, imagine the waves of the Silurian coastline, the first faint green spreading over stone, the soft hiss of ancient tides against rock that will someday be mountain. This is the beginning of Earth's second act, the one where life takes its first breath on land. When a planet recovers from disaster, it does not rush. It exhales slowly, cautiously, as though testing the balance of things. The Silurian world began in such a breath. Before it, the late Ordovician extinction had carved deep wounds into the oceans. Ice had reached far from the poles, locking up water, dropping sea levels, stripping coastlines bare. The temperature had plummeted. Vast portions of the continental shelves had fallen silent as the life that once covered them vanished almost overnight in geological terms. When the ice began to melt again, the water returned to the lands, flooding ancient valleys and filling them with new light. For millions of years, the earth seemed to hold its breath between ruin and renewal. Imagine standing on the edge of one of those rising seas. The air is cool but soft, and a haze of moisture clings to the horizon. The sound of waves against stone echoes in a steady rhythm. There is no birdsong, no rustle of leaves, no distant hum of insects, only the steady breathing of the ocean as it reclaims the land it lost. Beneath the surface, life stirs again. Tiny at first, but determined, the survivors of extinction spread slowly through the water, adapting to new conditions, finding new niches, rebuilding the fragile chain of existence that the ice had broken. The Ordovician catastrophe had been harsh, but selective. It spared enough for the future to begin again. The hardiest corals survived in pockets of warm shallows. Certain species of trilobites, adaptable and persistent, made it through. A handful of brachiopods, early mollusks, and tiny shelled creatures clung to life in deeper waters. They became the seed stock for the Silurian Renaissance. With time, evolution began to diversify them again. The seas are filled with creatures that seem to echo the past, but also hint at something new. As the glaciers melted, nutrients washed into the oceans, fueling blooms of plankton. The water turned rich and turbid, heavy with microscopic life. This new abundance supported an explosion of small filter feeders. Early sponges, corals, and bryozoans began to colonize the empty seabeds. They spread in mats and clusters, creating the first new reefs of the era. These reefs were different from the grand structures we picture today, smaller and more delicate, but they marked a return to complexity. Wherever a reef grew, it provided shelter and food. Small creatures drifted in, predators followed, and ecosystems began to knit themselves together again. It was in this gentle reconstruction that the Silurian world found its rhythm. The climate settled into a warm, stable phase. The polar ice retreated almost entirely. The oceans covered much of the planet, creating shallow continental seas that shimmered with sunlight and warmth. These shallow zones were perfect nurseries for new life. Warm, oxygen-rich, and full of nutrients, they became the stage for a slow, biological recovery. Over tens of millions of years, the seas became busy again. Trilobites once more scuttled along the sea floor, their armored bodies leaving small trails in the sediment. Some species evolved spines and ridges, defensive shapes born from a world that was learning again how to compete. Brachiopods anchored themselves to rocks, filtering food from the passing currents. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies, though they were animals, extended their feathery arms to catch drifting particles. The ocean, which had once seemed empty, now moved again with quiet purpose. Farther up the food chain, something new was happening. Among the small, jawless fish that had survived the Ordovician, mutations began to open new possibilities. Cartilaginous skeletons became stronger, fins became more refined. Some lineages developed simple jaws, allowing them to bite and chew rather than simply filter or suck. This innovation changed everything. For the first time in Earth's history, active predation became widespread. A new balance emerged, prey adapting to escape, predators evolving to pursue. The Silurian Ocean, still peaceful in appearance, was becoming a laboratory for evolution. If you could look down into one of those seas, you'd see life at every scale. Transparent plankton drifting near the surface, tiny crustaceans darting through fields of algae, early fish gliding just above the seabed. Sunlight would ripple through the water, painting the sand below in pale gold. Here and there, the remains of ancient corals formed reefs no higher than a person's waist. Soft-bodied creatures moved slowly through the shallows, leaving faint trails behind them that would someday become fossils. It was a world rebuilding itself quietly but thoroughly. Meanwhile, above the water, the continents still bore the scars of their frozen past. The land remained barren. No trees, no grasses, only the slow weathering of rock under wind and rain. But those processes were not idle. As the ice melted, rivers returned, carving valleys, carrying minerals to the sea. Every flood, every storm contributed to the long, patient reshaping of the landscape. With each cycle, sediment built up, forming new coastal plains and deltas. These would become the fertile edges where life would one day find a foothold. The continents themselves were smaller and scattered differently than today. Most of what would become North America and Northern Europe were fused into a landmass called Laurentia and Baltica, drifting slowly toward one another. To the south lay the vast supercontinent of Gondwana, stretching across much of the southern hemisphere. Between them lay warm equatorial seas dotted with volcanic islands and shallow reefs. As these landmasses moved, they shifted ocean currents and wind patterns, creating the first hints of stable global climates. This stability was crucial. For the first time in a long while, Earth's temperature and sea levels remained relatively constant. There were no massive ice sheets threatening to return, no sudden global upheavals. In this calm, ecosystems could establish long-term balance. Coral reefs expanded dramatically, spreading across continental shelves and forming the foundation for diverse marine communities. Some of these reefs stretched for hundreds of kilometers, vast underwater cities built by organisms no bigger than a fingernail. Inside these reefs, evolution experimented endlessly. New kinds of predators emerged. Eurypterids, or sea scorpions, grew to impressive sizes, some nearly 2 meters long. They patrolled the seabeds and shallows, their segmented bodies gliding with surprising grace. They were among the first large predators to dominate coastal ecosystems. Their presence added tension to the web of life, a reminder that survival always demanded adaptation. The Silurian seas also saw the refinement of early vertebrates. The jawed fish, or gnathostoms, began to diverge into two great lineages, the ancestors of modern sharks and rays, and the precursors of bony fish. The appearance of jaws was one of evolution's great turning points, giving rise to active feeding strategies and more complex behaviors. These fish were still small and primitive by modern standards, but they were pioneers of a future oceanic order. Every layer of sediment from this time holds quiet stories of adaptation. Fossilized reefs reveal intricate patterns of growth, showing how coral colonies responded to light and current. The shells of brachiopods record subtle shifts in ocean chemistry. Tiny spores preserved in rock mark the early steps of plants onto land. Each fragment captures a moment in Earth's slow awakening. The calm after catastrophe was not truly still, it was a slow-motion storm of innovation. Life had been nearly wiped out, but in its recovery, it became more complex, more resilient. The Silurian world demonstrates how deeply life and environment are entwined. As organisms evolved, they altered their surroundings, and those changes in turn shaped their evolution. Coral reefs created habitats that supported more life. Plants on the coast began to alter the air and soil. Oxygen levels rose, carbon dioxide levels fell, and the climate adjusted. The feedback loops that define Earth's living systems today were beginning to take hold. If we could somehow condense that time into a single film, we'd watch continents drift, climate stabilize, and ecosystems reassemble. It would be a slow but steady dance of recovery. The ocean's color would shift from pale blue to rich green as plankton multiplied. Sediment would accumulate in layers, building the rock that now forms our cliffs and hills. The surface of the planet would begin to shimmer with signs of renewal, like the faintest dawn after a long night. One of the most beautiful aspects of studying the Silurian is realizing how much it reveals about resilience. The world had been through devastation, and yet it didn't stay broken. It reorganized itself. The survivors didn't just fill the old roles, they created new ones. The extinction cleared the slate, and evolution wrote a more intricate story upon it. Many of the patterns that define modern ecosystems, predator and prey dynamics, reef building, food webs that span surface to sea floor, took their mature form in these warm Silurian waters. The climate itself likely played a nurturing role. Geological evidence suggests that carbon dioxide levels were high, keeping temperatures warm and preventing further glaciation. The sea levels rose and stabilized, flooding vast regions of the continents and creating shallow, sunlit environments perfect for life. Storms would have been frequent but not catastrophic, their winds stirring nutrients into circulation. Under such conditions, evolution had room to breathe, and life on land, though still minimal, was not entirely absent. Along the damp coasts, microbial mats spread in thin layers, trapping sediments and forming fragile crusts. Tiny, moss-like plants began to take root in cracks and low depressions where moisture lingered. They absorbed sunlight and began releasing oxygen into the air, ever so slightly changing its composition. These were small steps, but they would lead to the greatest transformation in Earth's surface since the origin of life itself. From a distance, the Silurian might appear uneventful, but that stillness is deceptive. Beneath it, vast changes were unfolding. The biosphere was knitting itself together again after near collapse, learning how to interact with land, atmosphere, and sea in new ways. What had once been a world defined by ocean life alone was slowly preparing to expand its domain. The calm was not an ending, it was a beginning disguised as peace. In this tranquil equilibrium, every ripple, every tide, every cycle of growth carried significance. Each coral colony that flourished meant more oxygen in the water. Each new predator pushed prey to adapt, refining anatomy and behavior. Each rainfall that washed sediment from the continents added nutrients to the ocean. The planet was gradually building the foundation for its next grand transformation. If you picture it long enough, you can almost hear it. The faint murmur of waves over newly formed reefs, the distant thunder of volcanic islands, the gentle sigh of tides shaping future coastlines. The silence of the land contrasts sharply with the growing hum beneath the waves. It's as though the world itself is whispering that something new is on its way. The Silurian recovery wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was quiet persistence, repeated over millions of years. It reminds us that recovery is rarely instant, that rebuilding often happens quietly in the background, unseen until one day the results are impossible to ignore. That lesson echoes through every later era. The Devonian forests, the Carboniferous swamps, the Jurassic plains, all owe their existence to the stability and patience born here. As the calm deepened and the oceans filled again with life, the stage was set for the next act. The shallow seas would soon become living cathedrals of coral and crinoids, full of color and movement. The first signs of complex land ecosystems would begin to appear. The Silurian was preparing the canvas for a world that was about to turn green. And as we drift forward through this forgotten age, the surface of the planet starts to shimmer with possibility. The light on the water grows brighter, the waves gentler, and somewhere in the quiet shallows, a new kind of life begins to take hold. Fragile, small, but unstoppable. Beneath the surface of the Silurian seas, the world was unrecognizable from the one we know today. There were no whales, no coral fish in bright colors, no turtles gliding lazily through warm currents. Instead, the ocean was filled with forms that seemed halfway between dreams and blueprints. The light above was softer, the water shallower, and the creatures within it stranger, older but no less alive. The seafloor stretched for miles, covered in fine sand and sediment, freshly laid down by rivers returning from the continents. These coastal waters were the most vibrant places on the planet. The sunlight could reach the bottom here, turning the upper layers of water into transparent fields of blue and green. Where the light was strongest, reefs began to form. Not the stony coral gardens of the modern tropics, but living structures built by organisms that would seem primitive to us now. Early corals, called tabulates and rugose corals, grew in colonies that resembled tiny stone honeycombs. Together, they built reefs that teemed with activity, acting as nurseries for other life. Around these reefs, countless small animals drifted. Many of them were filter feeders, depending on the constant rain of microscopic plankton that filled the water. The currents carried fine dust from the land, nutrients from volcanic eruptions, and organic debris from countless living things. In this suspended soup of life, the sea sparkled with movement. The trilobites were everywhere. They crawled across the seabed in slow, deliberate motions, their jointed legs stirring up silt. Their bodies were divided into segments, each one plated in hard armor, giving them a rigid, almost mechanical appearance. Some were only the size of your fingertip, others as large as a dinner plate. They lived in groups, moving like quiet herds, foraging through the sediment for detritus and tiny prey. Occasionally one would stop, curl into a ball, and wait. They could do this instantly, their hard exoskeleton locking tight around their soft underside. It was their defense against a growing number of predators. Predation in the Silurian seas was still a relatively new idea. For hundreds of millions of years before, most life had been passive, filtering, grazing, drifting. But now, with the evolution of jaws and better mobility, animals could hunt. Among the most formidable of these early hunters were the eurypterids, or sea scorpions. Some were small and harmless, gliding through the water with long, paddle-like limbs. Others grew to nearly 2 meters, their bodies covered in armor plates, their claws capable of snatching up smaller creatures. They were the giants of their time, slow but precise, ruling the shallows with quiet authority. If you were to drift alongside one of these eurypterids, you'd notice that their movements were surprisingly graceful. They didn't swim like fish. Instead, they rode gently with their flattened limbs, steering with their tails. When they needed to, they could bury themselves in sand, waiting for prey to pass. Their eyes, complex and well-developed, allowed them to see clearly, even in dim light. They were among the first creatures to truly master the art of hunting in water, the blueprint for all that would come after. Nearby, other animals filled the remaining niches. The oceans of the Silurian were home to brachiopods, creatures that looked like clams but were unrelated. Each one anchored itself to a rock or buried partway in mud, opening its shell to draw in water and filter food. They were quiet, consistent presences in the ecosystem, patient, unchanging, dependable. When you see a fossil brachiopod today, it's easy to miss the life it once represented. But during the Silurian, these were among the most successful creatures on Earth. Crinoids, sometimes mistaken for plants because of their stalked, flower-like appearance, swayed gently in the current. They were echinoderms, distant relatives of sea stars and sea urchins, and their feathery arms caught drifting particles from the water. Together they created undersea meadows of motion, vast and hypnotic fields that waved in rhythm with the tides. To modern eyes, the Silurian reefs would have looked alive in every direction, not with swimming fish, but with waving, filtering, and crawling organisms, forming a slow, breathing landscape. Above them all, small, jawless fish moved in loose schools. They were covered in bony plates that acted as armor, their mouths simple, round openings for suction feeding. They had no fins, as we think of them, only stiff flaps that helped them balance. Yet even these awkward swimmers were an evolutionary success. They occupied the middle ground between passive drifting and active motion, a crucial step toward the agile vertebrates that would one day dominate the seas. The water itself was different from modern oceans. It was warmer, saltier in places, and often cloudy with sediments. Visibility varied from clear shallows near reefs to murky depths where volcanic minerals tinted the water green and brown. But in the light, where life was richest, it must have been dazzling. Silvery fish flashed beneath the surface, eurypterids glided like shadows, and soft-bodied worms burrowed through the mud below. Everywhere you looked, something was moving, slowly, steadily, unhurriedly, as though the entire ocean was following a single quiet rhythm. This was not a world of chaos, but of balance. The extinction had cleared the ecological slate, and the Silurian was rewriting the rules. New life filled the voids in measured steps, and as each organism found its place, stability deepened. Coral reefs anchored coastlines, filtering the water and providing homes for countless species. Crinoids recycled nutrients. Fish and trilobites recycled nutrients through feeding and decay. Even the eurypterids, in their predatory efficiency, kept populations balanced. Evolution was not rushing toward complexity. It was maintaining equilibrium, testing every adaptation carefully against the slow flow of time. And within this quiet order, one of life's most important transitions was unfolding. In shallow lagoons near shore, where tides rose and fell each day, some creatures began to experience air for the first time. Tiny invertebrates clinging to rocks or algae were occasionally left exposed during low tide. Those that could survive these brief moments of dryness gained an advantage. Over generations, this selection pressure would shape the physiology of new species, preparing them unknowingly for the land above. The Silurian seas were, in that sense, more than ecosystems. They were classrooms. Every creature within them was learning lessons that would echo through deep time: how to regulate internal chemistry, how to store water, how to support a body against gravity. The first steps toward terrestrial life were being rehearsed here, quietly, beneath the waves. The continents surrounding these seas continued to drift. Their collision zones formed mountain chains that altered rainfall and erosion patterns. Rivers carried minerals from these highlands into the ocean, enriching it further. This steady supply of nutrients fueled even greater productivity near coasts. Over time, coral reefs expanded outward, creating enormous carbonate platforms, geological records of an age when the sea was the center of everything. If you could zoom out to see Earth from space in the Silurian, it would look like a planet covered mostly by water, dotted with small greenish-brown islands. The blue would be paler than today's, more turquoise near the equator, fading to deeper shades toward the poles. Clouds would swirl gently in consistent patterns, reflecting a world in climatic balance. It was a planet that had found its rhythm again after chaos, humming quietly under the sun. The shallow seas, these calm cradles of life, would endure for millions of years. In their depths, countless species would rise and fall, unseen but vital. They would set in motion the great changes to come: the spread of plants onto land, the rise of vertebrates, the transformation of air and soil. Without these seas, the next steps of life would never have been possible. As the centuries turned to millennia and the millennia to eons, these gentle giants of the ocean continued their patient work. Coral by coral, shell by shell, they built the architecture of tomorrow's Earth. When we find their remains today in cliffs, in quarries, in stones that line old garden walls, we are looking at the bones of ancient oceans. The very ground beneath our feet was once the bottom of those warm Silurian shallows. If you trace the outline of a fossil coral with your finger, you're touching the story of this world. A time when life chose cooperation over chaos, when stability was its own triumph. It's humbling to think that from these peaceful seas, the foundations of modern ecosystems were laid. The Silurian Ocean was vast, calm, and forgiving. But it was not finished evolving. As the reefs grew taller and the predators more skilled, a new boundary beckoned, the silent shorelines of the continents. The waves lapped at barren rock, and on the edges of that desolation, the first green began to take hold. The sea had done its part. Now it was time for the land to awaken. If you could rise up out of the Silurian Sea and stand on the nearest stretch of land, the first thing you'd notice is how everything still feels. The world above the water is almost empty. No grass underfoot, no trees stretching toward the light, no birds or insects to fill the air with motion or sound. It is a landscape built from stone, dust, and wind. The silence isn't peaceful exactly, it's deeper than that. It feels as though the planet itself hasn't yet learned what to do with the surface it has. The continents in this age are young and raw. The rocks are sharp, unweathered, and exposed. Volcanic ridges run through plains of eroded basalt. The ground is strewn with minerals, iron, magnesium, calcium, fresh from the Earth's mantle. When the sun beats down, the light bounces from the stone in harsh flashes. When it rains, the water has nothing to hold it. It rushes in torrents down slopes and gullies, carving shallow channels that lead back to the sea. Without roots to stabilize the soil, every storm rearranges the surface. The air carries the tang of minerals and salt. It is thinner than what we breathe now, with lower oxygen and higher carbon dioxide. You would probably find it sharp and heavy at once, not poisonous, but strange. Without plants, there are no scents of vegetation, no pollen, no earthy smell after rain. The aroma of the planet is entirely geological: wet stone, volcanic sulfur, metal dust. It is a reminder that this is still a young world, ruled by chemistry rather than biology. If you look across the horizon, you might see faint colors here and there, streaks of reddish-brown rock, dark volcanic fields, pale layers of sand and clay. But there is no green. The color that would one day define Earth's surface hasn't yet arrived. The continents are washed in muted tones of gray, rust, and beige. The beauty here lies in form rather than life. The curve of an eroded ridge, the glint of quartz in the sunlight, the smooth plane of a tidal flat drying under the sun. Despite the barrenness, the land is not entirely dead. Life has begun to test it tentatively, in small, cautious steps along the coasts where waves retreat each day. The wet surfaces provide shelter for microscopic colonies of algae and cyanobacteria. These tiny organisms can tolerate brief exposure to air before the next tide returns. They cling to damp rock in thin, dark films, trapping particles of sediment. Over time, these mats build small layers of organic material, a first fragile skin on the Earth's surface. In a few places, simple plant-like forms have taken root. They are nothing like trees or shrubs, or even the grasses that will someday cover plains. They have no true roots, leaves, or wood. They are small, upright filaments, barely taller than a hand, anchored to rock by hair-like threads. Their bodies are soft, built from cells that must stay wet to survive. When the air dries too much, they collapse and wait for the next mist or tide to revive them. These are the earliest land plants, ancestors of all future forests. And though they would look insignificant to us, they are doing something revolutionary. They're taking sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide and turning them into living matter. Each patch of these early plants changes its surroundings ever so slightly. They hold moisture on the rock longer than bare stone would. They trap wind-blown dust. They create small pockets where microbes can thrive. And in doing so, they begin to alter the chemistry of the land. Over millions of years, these changes add up. The air becomes more oxygenated, the rock begins to weather faster, reacting with organic acids produced by microbes. Soil, the thin film that would one day feed all terrestrial life, is beginning to form for the first time. At first, this transformation is barely noticeable. Most of the continents remain bare. The green patches are small, isolated, confined to the wettest places, river deltas, tidal flats, the spray zones of coastal cliffs. But evolution works patiently. Every generation that manages to survive a little longer out of the water passes that advantage on. The plants begin to develop thicker walls, more robust anchoring structures, more efficient ways to hold moisture. Eventually, some species no longer need to live entirely submerged. They can withstand hours, then days of exposure to the air. These first colonizers probably looked like low mats or thin branching stalks. Their descendants would give rise to early vascular plants, the ones that develop tubes to transport water and nutrients. That innovation will come a bit later, but its foundations are here in this quiet experimental stage. The land is learning to host life. In between these green beginnings, there are other pioneers at work, fungi and bacteria that live in symbiosis. Some fungi attach themselves to plant filaments, helping them absorb minerals in exchange for sugars. This partnership, simple though it seems, will become one of the most important collaborations in Earth's history. Fungi will extend the reach of plants, allowing them to pull nutrients from solid rock. The resulting chemical reactions will alter the atmosphere further, drawing down carbon dioxide and cooling the planet slightly. The biosphere and geosphere are beginning to interact in complex ways. For the first time, the land is part of the living system. Until this point, life and environment were mostly confined to the oceans. The continents were passive backdrops, shaped by erosion and tectonics, but untouched by biology. Now, biology is touching back. Every small plant, every microbial mat, every fungal thread participates in a slow conversation with the rocks and the air. The result will be a world transformed, but for now, it remains quiet, cautious, and almost empty. If you were standing there, it would feel strange, an Earth familiar in shape, but alien in atmosphere. The horizon would stretch, unbroken by vegetation. The only movement would come from wind lifting dust, clouds drifting slowly overhead, and waves breaking on distant shores. At night, the stars would appear sharper, the air clearer. With no trees or moisture to scatter light, the sky would be darker than anything we know. You could see the Milky Way spread across the heavens in flawless detail, mirrored faintly in the still waters of shallow seas. Yet, even under that silent sky, life is at work in hidden corners. In tide pools, strange small creatures adapted to brackish conditions crawl and feed. Early arthropods, ancestors of scorpions and insects, venture briefly onto damp rocks to scavenge before retreating. Their tracks press into wet sand, some preserved forever when the next tide buries them in silt. Each footprint is a message from the edge of habitability, a record of a species testing boundaries. These experiments will continue for millions of years. Slowly, the relationship between sea and land will change. Every new patch of plant cover alters erosion patterns. Each coastal marsh holds sediment a little longer, forming deltas and lagoons. The continents are stabilizing. What was once naked stone is beginning to host cycles of growth and decay, however primitive. The air, too, is changing in response. The combined effect of marine photosynthesis and these first land plants is gradually increasing oxygen levels. By the end of the Silurian, the atmosphere is richer, more breathable, though still thin compared to today. This oxygen will open the door for larger, more active land animals in the ages to come. But at this moment, it's simply a side effect of survival, a byproduct of the planet learning to use sunlight more efficiently. Geologists studying ancient rocks from this time find traces of these changes in the form of isotopic shifts. Tiny differences in the ratios of elements like carbon and sulfur that reflect biological activity. Some layers contain fossilized spores, evidence of early plant reproduction. Others preserve the chemical signatures of oxygen interacting with minerals. These clues, scattered across the world, confirm what the stones themselves cannot show directly, that life was here, small but persistent, quietly rewriting the chemistry of the continents. It's easy to underestimate how radical this step was. For billions of years, life had been confined to the oceans, protected from ultraviolet radiation, supported by buoyancy, surrounded by the water it needed to function. To leave that safety behind was an immense evolutionary challenge. The first plants had to invent new ways to stay hydrated, to stand upright, to reproduce without the constant presence of water. They were solving problems that had never existed before. The landscape they entered was harsh but full of potential. Without other life to compete with, any successful adaptation spread quickly. Without roots, there were no trees to cast shade or absorb nutrients. Without herbivores, there was no grazing pressure. The first colonizers could expand wherever moisture and light allowed. In doing so, they began to modify the climate itself. The new green surfaces absorbed sunlight differently than bare rock. Evaporation from plant tissues added humidity to the air. Tiny shifts like these, multiplied across continents, began to influence weather patterns. Rain became more regular in some regions, more intense in others. The feedback between biology and climate had begun. This process was slow, measured not in centuries, but in millions of years. Yet, from our distant perspective, we can see its direction clearly. The land, once barren, is moving toward fertility. The green is coming, not as a sudden bloom, but as a gradual tide, spreading from coast to interior, from the edges of rivers to the cracks of cliffs. Each new plant, each cooperative microbe, each grain of forming soil is part of a larger transformation. The earth turning into a world that can sustain forests, animals, and eventually us. The silence of the Silurian land was temporary. In time, it would be replaced by the murmur of wind through stems and the whisper of leaves. But in this early stage, there is something profound about its emptiness. It is the calm before the most consequential expansion in the history of life. The continents are waiting, their surfaces ready, their minerals untouched, their rivers carving the shapes that future ecosystems will fill. When you imagine it, you can almost see the first faint green spreading over the horizon like dawn light. The air above the coast shimmers with moisture. The rock glistens, and in the shallow depressions between ridges, the earliest mats of life thicken each year. Nothing rushes, nothing hurries. Evolution works quietly here, in soft pulses of adaptation. The silence is not absence, but anticipation. In the coming ages, these small plants will evolve into larger, more complex forms. They will send roots deeper, lift stems higher, and reshape the atmosphere until it can support forests. But for now, they remain close to the ground, humble and unnoticed. If you were to bend down and touch one, you would feel a thin layer of moisture and the faint slickness of living tissue. That touch would connect you directly to the beginning of all terrestrial ecosystems, to the moment when the land first began to live. The world is not yet green, but it's learning how to be. The oceans continue to hum with energy, feeding the air with oxygen. The shores fill slowly with life's first architects, microbes, fungi, and plants, building the foundation for soil. The continents, once barren stone, are becoming part of the biosphere. And somewhere, just beyond the line where sea meets rock, another transformation is starting, the air itself carrying the first breaths of a living world. The shift from silence to growth was slow, but it was happening everywhere at once across the low, flat coastlines of the Silurian world. Life was beginning to take hold. The change was subtle, so gradual that no creature alive then could have noticed it. The oceans still dominated the planet. The air still carried the taste of salt and minerals. Yet along the margins where water met rock, the first true ecosystems on land were forming, built by organisms that had learned to hold fast against the dry air and unfiltered sunlight. The pioneers of this transformation were simple by our standards, but they were not fragile. They were small, yes, tiny stalks rising no higher than a few centimeters, but every one of them represented a leap in adaptation. Their ancestors had been algae, soft-bodied and entirely dependent on water. These new forms had learned how to survive between tides, how to endure evaporation, how to pull moisture into their tissues and hold it there. In a sense, they were inventing dryness, redefining what it meant to live on Earth. They clung to damp ground along river deltas and tidal flats. When the sun was low and the mist heavy, their surfaces glistened with dew. When the air dried, they curled inward to protect their delicate cells. Then, when the fog rolled back in or a light rain returned, they unfurled again. It was a simple rhythm, driven by the environment rather than by choice, but it worked. Over millions of years, it was enough to allow them to spread. These early land plants didn't yet have true roots. They anchored themselves using rhizoids, thin filaments that acted like threads, gripping rock and sediment. The attachment was weak compared to modern roots, but it kept them steady through wind and water flow. More importantly, those threads allowed them to draw in water from the surface beneath them. Over time, this simple structure evolved into a more sophisticated network, something that could penetrate deeper, reach moisture even when the surface dried. This was the beginning of the first roots, one of the most important inventions in the history of life. Roots did more than hold plants upright. They began to break down rock as they pushed into cracks and pores. They released organic acids that dissolved minerals, freeing nutrients like phosphorus and calcium. Those elements were absorbed by the plant and cycled back into the environment when it died. With every generation, more rock turned into soil. Each patch of vegetation enriched its surroundings, paving the way for more growth. This was a feedback loop that would eventually transform the continents from bare stone to living ground. The chemistry of the atmosphere was changing too. Photosynthesis on land added a new dimension to the planet's oxygen production. Before this, most oxygen had come from the oceans, from algae and cyanobacteria that filled the water with gas, some of which escaped into the air. Now that process was happening directly on the continents. The air itself was becoming more breathable. The balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide was shifting, slowly but steadily. Within a few tens of millions of years, the atmosphere would be rich enough to support complex animals outside the water. But for now, the only animals that ventured onto land did so briefly and cautiously. Primitive arthropods, distant relatives of insects and crabs, explored the damp edges of tidal flats. Some grazed on the thin mats of algae and fungi that grew there. Others hunted small invertebrates hiding in the mud. These visits were short, but they marked another step forward. As plants began to spread, they created shade, moisture, and new sources of food. Each one of those changes encouraged animals to spend just a little more time on land. Evolution was building a staircase, one small step at a time. In the air above these coasts, the sunlight was harsh. There was no ozone layer thick enough yet to fully block ultraviolet radiation. The first plants had to evolve protective pigments to shield themselves from the sun's intensity. Some produced dark-colored compounds that absorbed harmful rays, giving their surfaces a brown or reddish hue. Others developed waxy coatings to prevent water loss. These adaptations not only kept them alive, but also helped shape how future plants would look and function. Every innovation that began as a survival strategy here would later become standard biology. It's strange to imagine a world where green is new, For billions of years, the Earth's palette had been dominated by blues, greys, and browns, the colors of rock, sea, and sky. Now, green was beginning to spread, and it wasn't just an aesthetic shift. It represented the first large-scale capture of solar energy on land. Chlorophyll, the pigment that gives plants their color, is incredibly efficient at turning light into chemical energy. Every patch of green that appeared meant more sunlight being stored, more energy entering the terrestrial ecosystem. The continents were beginning to generate their own life cycles rather than relying on the sea. As plants expanded, they began to shape weather and erosion. Their presence trapped dust, slowed down the flow of rainwater, and stabilized riverbanks. Over time, this reduced how much sediment washed into the oceans, changing the chemistry of coastal waters. Reefs that had once been periodically smothered by silt began to thrive more consistently. The link between land and sea grew stronger. What happened on one side now influenced the other. This connection would deepen throughout the rest of Earth's history, forming the basis for global climate systems. The Silurian climate itself was remarkably stable compared to the chaos that came before. The planet had warmed after the Ordovician Ice Age, and for millions of years, the temperatures stayed mild. The poles were largely ice-free, and the equatorial regions were humid. Rain fell frequently along the coastlines, creating perfect conditions for early plants. Even inland, occasional storms delivered enough moisture for small colonies to survive. This environmental stability gave evolution the consistency it needed. Without sudden freezes or mass die-offs, complexity could accumulate gradually. Geologists studying Silurian rocks often find signs of repeated wetting and drying, thin layers of sediment that indicate alternating exposure and flooding. These layers tell the story of a landscape in transition, one that spent much of its time shifting between water and air. It was in these unstable zones that the first roots evolved. Plants that could hold on through both states, wet and dry, had the advantage. Over generations, their anchoring systems grew deeper and more complex, forming channels that could carry water up and nutrients down. The first vascular tissue, specialized for transport, evolved soon after. It was this development that allowed plants to grow taller, to compete for sunlight, and to survive in drier conditions. From a modern perspective, these were tiny steps, almost imperceptible, but they were cumulative. The invention of roots, stems, and vascular systems was nothing less than the creation of a new kind of biosphere. For the first time, life could expand vertically, not just horizontally. It could build structures that interacted with wind and gravity. The land was no longer static. It was beginning to breathe, to circulate, to evolve. Imagine walking through one of these early landscapes. Though walking might not be the right word, since no humans or even vertebrates existed yet. You would move across ground that felt uneven, sometimes soft with moisture, sometimes hard with rock. Around you, small clusters of plants would rise like miniature forests, no higher than your ankles. The air would carry a faint organic scent, something between wet stone and crushed moss. If you looked closely, you might see fine threads spreading between the plants, fungal hyphae forming the first underground networks. These hidden structures connected colonies together, sharing water and nutrients. Even at this early stage, life was cooperative as well as competitive. In places where volcanic activity was common, the heat from vents created pockets of steam and mineral-rich pools. These environments were ideal incubators for evolution. The combination of warmth, moisture, and chemistry accelerated biological experimentation. Fossils from such regions show an abundance of early plant spores and fragments. It's likely that the first major diversification of land plants occurred near these geothermal sites. The same processes that once built mountains were now nurturing biology. As the Silurian progressed, the appearance of the continents changed noticeably. From above, their coastlines began to look darker. tinged with the faintest green and brown. The inland regions remained barren, but the edges were alive. Over time, those living edges crept farther from the sea. Rivers carried plant fragments and spores upstream. Wind dispersed microscopic seeds across the plains. Some landed in favorable spots, moist depressions, shaded crevices, and began new colonies. What started as isolated patches grew into connected carpets. The green frontier was expanding. The spread of plants had far-reaching consequences for the atmosphere. By drawing down carbon dioxide during photosynthesis and locking it away in organic material and sediments, these early plants contributed to a gradual cooling of the climate. It was a slow process, but by the late Silurian and into the Devonian, it would lead to new patterns of temperature and precipitation. The planet was regulating itself through biology. For the first time, the Earth had gained a thermostat. This feedback between life and environment was subtle but powerful. When plants grew, they removed carbon dioxide, which cooled the climate. Cooler temperatures reduced weathering rates, which in turn slowed the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, creating balance. This kind of equilibrium would define Earth's climate for hundreds of millions of years. The roots of it, literally and figuratively, can be traced back to the Silurian. In every sense, the first roots changed everything. They connected the living and non-living worlds more intimately than ever before. They allowed plants to draw sustenance from the planet's crust and to return nutrients to it through decay. They linked the carbon cycle, the water cycle, and the mineral cycle into one continuous system. Before roots, land was inert. After roots, it became active, a participant in life rather than a stage for it. Even today, we can see the evidence of this transformation in ancient rocks. Silurian soils, known as paleosols, contain traces of root-like structures. Tiny channels filled with minerals that once surrounded living tissue. These are the earliest signs of terrestrial ecosystems. To a trained geologist, a thin section of such rock is like a time capsule, showing how life began to alter the land from the inside out. Each fossilized rhizoid or early root fragment is a signature of cooperation between biology and geology. It's humbling to think that the very ground we walk on exists because of these first roots. Soil, that thin layer between rock and air, is a living legacy of the Silurian. Without it, plants would never have spread inland. Animals would never have followed, and the planet would never have developed the stable climate we depend on. The formation of soil was the beginning of permanence, the moment when life stopped being confined to the sea and became a permanent feature of the continents. By the end of the Silurian, the world looked different from the one that began the age. The reefs were larger, the fish more diverse, the air more oxygenated, and the land no longer lifeless. The green was spreading, the roots were deepening, and the planet was breathing more fully than ever before. The forgotten age was quietly reshaping everything that would come after. And as we move forward through this world's timeline, the rhythm of change continues. The air, now touched by oxygen and humidity, begins to support new forms of life. The sky no longer feels like a distant dome, but a part of the system, carrying moisture from sea to shore and back again. The Earth has learned a new pattern: growth balanced by decay, land connected to the ocean, rock transformed by roots. The calm blue planet of the Silurian is beginning to show its first hints of green, and with them, the promise of everything that would follow. As the first roots dug deeper and the land began to soften, the sky above it started to change. It had always been there, vast and silent, carrying sunlight and storms, but it had never truly interacted with the surface below. The air was a mixture of gases shaped mostly by volcanoes and oceans. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen, water vapor, and only a modest trace of oxygen. Now, that balance was shifting. The planet had begun to breathe differently. What made the difference was not a single event, but millions of years of quiet chemistry. Every small patch of green, every film of moss, every early plant clinging to a rock was exhaling oxygen into the air. It didn't seem like much. The output of a single organism was negligible, but the process never stopped. As plants spread and multiplied, the air above them began to fill with a new kind of energy. The sunlight that struck a leaf no longer just warmed it. It was transformed into the invisible exchange that would reshape the atmosphere itself. In the oceans, photosynthetic organisms had been producing oxygen for billions of years. Most of that gas had dissolved into the water, reacting with iron and other elements. It was the oceans that built up the first reserves of oxygen, long before the air ever did. But the land was a different story. Once plants began to grow in the open, their oxygen had nowhere to go but upward. The thin veil of atmosphere around the planet became infused with it, molecule by molecule, until the chemistry of the sky began to change. It's difficult to grasp how gradual this was. The Silurian atmosphere didn't suddenly become breathable. It thickened with oxygen in increments too small for any living thing to notice. Yet those increments mattered. A slightly higher concentration meant the difference between an ocean that could support larger animals and one that could not. It meant that air pockets in the soil could host microbial life. It meant that lightning could spark fires for the first time in certain dry regions, recycling carbon back into the system. The rise of oxygen was not just a biological milestone. It was the beginning of Earth's modern cycles of energy. The mechanism was simple enough. Plants absorbed carbon dioxide and water, used sunlight to split them apart, and released oxygen as a byproduct. But this simple process had enormous implications. Carbon dioxide trapped heat, while oxygen did not. By slowly drawing down the former and releasing the latter, plants began to cool the climate. The feedback loop we now take for granted, life regulating temperature through atmospheric composition, was taking shape for the first time. The change was visible in subtle ways. The color of the sky deepened slightly as the atmosphere grew clearer. The haze that had once hung over the land began to thin. The air became more transparent to sunlight, but also more protective, as ozone began to accumulate in the upper layers. Ozone, formed from oxygen molecules struck by ultraviolet radiation, absorbed much of the harmful UV light that had once scorched the surface. With each generation of plants, the world became a little safer for life to live under the open sky. It's strange to think that without this transformation, the very concept of blue skies and breathable air wouldn't exist. The Earth before plants would have looked hazier, its horizon blurred by dust and volcanic gas. The sunlight would have felt harsher, its rays unfiltered and white. As oxygen increased, scattering effects changed the quality of light. The atmosphere began to glow with that familiar softness we now call blue, a product not of water or distance, but of molecules shaped by life itself. In geological terms, the evidence of this shift lies in rocks rich with oxidized minerals. Iron, which once accumulated in the form of grey or black deposits, began to rust in the presence of free oxygen, turning red and brown. These iron oxides mark the gradual oxygenation of soils and sediments. When geologists find them, they're seeing the fingerprints of the sky's awakening, a world learning to breathe and to react to that breath. The biological consequences were just as profound. As oxygen accumulated, animals began to take advantage of it. In the seas, the rise in oxygen concentration allowed for greater metabolic efficiency. Fish could swim faster, hunt longer, and grow larger. Predators became more active, prey more alert. The evolutionary arms race intensified, driving the development of new forms and behaviors. Life's complexity accelerated, powered by the chemistry of the air. Even on land, where oxygen levels were still lower than they would later become, the difference was noticeable to those few pioneering organisms that ventured out. Arthropods exploring the shorelines could extract more energy per breath. Their muscles worked longer before fatigue. The improved air chemistry allowed them to experiment with new kinds of movement, new ways of inhabiting the margin between sea and land. These early forays were brief, but they hinted at the future. Meanwhile, the plants themselves were adapting to the new atmosphere they were creating. Higher oxygen levels increased the risk of oxidative damage to cells, prompting the evolution of antioxidant defenses, chemical systems that protect tissues from the very gases they produce. It was an elegant balance, life shaping its environment and then learning how to survive within that change. The interconnectedness of everything became more apparent with each passing epoch. More plants meant more oxygen, which meant more ozone, which meant less ultraviolet radiation. Less UV allowed plants to grow higher and spread farther inland. That expansion increased photosynthesis, producing even more oxygen. The cycle reinforced itself until the Earth had built a stable, breathable atmosphere. At night, under this new sky, the temperature of the land began to behave differently. Before plants, the rocky continents had little capacity to hold heat. After sunset, they cooled rapidly. But now, the thin layer of vegetation and soil retained moisture, releasing it slowly as vapor. That water interacted with oxygen and carbon dioxide, influencing cloud formation and rainfall. The weather patterns of Earth were shifting toward the ones we recognize today, a dynamic, self-regulating climate moderated by living things. If you could have stood somewhere along a Silurian coastline and watched the transition, it would not have looked dramatic. The stars above would have seemed as bright as ever, the air still clear and dry. But unseen, the composition of that air was evolving. The ozone layer, forming far above, was changing the way sunlight reached the surface. The mornings would have grown slightly softer, the sunsets more vivid. Each of those subtle changes made the planet more habitable, not by design, but by consequence. Oxygen did not just change the physics of the atmosphere, it altered its color and its sound. The increased density of the air allowed it to carry vibrations differently. Over time, the world became capable of sustaining the range of frequencies that we associate with modern soundscapes. The rustle of leaves, the buzz of insects, the resonance of birdsong that would come much later. The birth of the atmosphere as we know it was also, indirectly, the birth of sound in open air. But for now, the Silurian sky was still quiet. The only noises came from wind passing over rock, the hiss of rain, and the distant murmur of waves. These sounds carried farther now, the air denser and more responsive. They echoed across the bare hills, soft and elongated, like the planet humming to itself. Each storm played a role in this grand adjustment. When lightning struck, it split nitrogen molecules in the air, allowing them to combine with oxygen and form nitrates. These compounds washed down with rain and fertilized the land. Plants absorbed them, used them, and in turn strengthened their roots and tissues. The cycle between sky and soil tightened further. The weather, once a purely physical force, had become a biological one too. The balance between gases was delicate. Too little oxygen, and life suffocated. Too much, and fires would rage uncontrollably. The Silurian found a middle ground. The level of oxygen stabilized just below the threshold, where combustion could easily occur. This equilibrium allowed evolution to proceed without interruption. The air was alive, but not yet dangerous, full of potential, but still under control. The rise in oxygen also affected the ocean. Surface waters absorbed more of the gas, extending the oxygenated layer deeper than before. This expansion of habitable zones allowed new ecosystems to form. Coral reefs grew larger, hosting a wider variety of species. The seas near the coast became rich in nutrients, supporting food chains that reached farther up the ladder of complexity. Life in the water and the air were now synchronized in a single global system. It's remarkable to think that everything we take for granted, the color of the sky, the ease of breathing, the cycles of clouds and rain, originated from this quiet transformation. The atmosphere we live in is not a static shell. It's the living product of countless generations of plants exhaling. The air is a collective creation, built molecule by ancient organisms that never saw the results of their work. As the Silurian wore on, the new air encouraged further colonization of land. Plants ventured farther inland, following rivers and lakes. Some developed tougher outer layers to resist drying. Others improved their vascular systems to transport water efficiently. The more they spread, the more oxygen they released. By the end of the period, the planet had entered a new equilibrium. The world no longer felt divided between lifeless land and living sea. It was one connected system, breathing through its oceans by day and through its plants by night. If you could breathe that air yourself, it might still feel thin compared to what you're used to, but it would no longer leave you gasping. It would smell faintly of minerals and moisture, with the first hints of organic scent, a trace of decomposition, the fragrance of early soil. In the mornings, mist would form where warm air met cool ground, swirling above the patches of vegetation. Sunlight breaking through that mist would scatter into golden beams, illuminating a planet in transition. Somewhere deep within this changing atmosphere, ozone was accumulating faster than ever. It formed an invisible shield that would allow larger and more complex life to evolve safely on land. This was the silent gift of the Silurian, the creation of a breathable, protective sky. It didn't arrive with fanfare or noise. It arrived in stillness, in the quiet pulse of photosynthesis, repeated billions of times over millions of years. The Earth was no longer just a rocky world covered in oceans. It had become something new, a planet with weather shaped by life, air shaped by biology, and light filtered through its own living chemistry. The line between geology and ecology had blurred completely. The sky, once indifferent, had joined the conversation. The breath of the planet was steady now. Oxygen flowed upward, carbon dioxide downward, the two entwined in perfect exchange. The winds carried spores inland. The rain carried nutrients back to the sea. The clouds gathered over the growing patches of green, releasing water that would soon sustain forests. The world had learned to recycle, to sustain, to breathe. And as this quiet balance settled in, the next transformation was already underway. The surface of the land, softened by roots and enriched by decay, was beginning to host a new kind of life. In the shadows beneath the first plants, something else was growing, a hidden network that would become the foundation for everything to come. Beneath the first green patches, where the dampness lingered between tides and rainstorms, something quiet but transformative was taking place. The surface of the Earth, which had been hard, mineral, and lifeless for billions of years, was changing from the bottom up. It was here, in the thin boundary between rock and air, that the first soil began to form. Not the rich, dark soil we know today, full of roots and humus, but its earliest version, a fragile mix of crushed minerals, decomposing plants, and microscopic life working together in patterns that would come to define the living Earth. Soil is often taken for granted, but it is one of the most complex structures on the planet. It is both matter and process, both environment and organism. It is the skin of the continents, and during the Silurian, it was still being invented. The builders of this new world were not animals or even visible plants. They were smaller, older, and endlessly patient. Fungi, bacteria, and algae, the quiet architects of the land, were beginning to weave their networks through the young ground. The earliest soils likely formed in the sheltered places where water and life could linger after each tide. The rocks there were covered in microbial films, dark and slimy, trapping dust blown from nearby coasts. These films were sticky with organic compounds, and they began to bind the mineral grains together. When the microbes died, their remains mixed with fine sediments, creating a layer that was softer than bare rock, but still thin and unstable. Each new generation added another layer, deepening the structure by millimeters at a time. It took thousands of years to build a layer thick enough to hold water after the rain stopped, and millions to create soil deep enough for roots to penetrate. The main drivers of this process were fungi. Not yet the mushrooms we recognize today, but filamentous organisms made of countless thin threads. These threads, called hyphae, grew into the cracks of the rock, secreting acids that dissolved minerals. They pulled nutrients from the stone and shared them with nearby plants or algae in exchange for sugars. This cooperation was ancient, one of the first true symbioses in Earth's history. It allowed both partners to survive in conditions that neither could manage alone. Through this partnership, the fungi became engineers of the land. As they broke down rock, they created new surfaces for chemical reactions. The minerals released fed the plants, and when the plants died, their decaying tissues provided carbon for the fungi. Each cycle made the soil richer, thicker, and more complex. Bit by bit, the bare continents were being covered in a thin, living crust that held moisture, supported growth, and resisted erosion. It was an unseen revolution, the transformation of geology into ecology. If you could touch this early soil, it would feel coarse and gritty, with patches of dark organic matter scattered through it. In some places, it would crumble easily. In others, it would be crusted over by dried microbial mats. Its texture would vary from smooth clay to loose sand, depending on what kind of rock it came from and how long life had been at work there. Beneath the surface, the fungal networks would twist and branch like roots, though finer and more fragile. Under magnification, the soil would look like a miniature labyrinth. Grains of quartz and feldspar bound together by filaments, air pockets forming where organisms had lived and died, crystals forming where minerals had precipitated out of solution. It was a living mosaic, delicate but persistent. The chemistry of the soil was as important as its structure. As microbes digested organic material, they released carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases. Some of these rose into the atmosphere, joining the global cycles that maintained the climate. Others reacted within the soil to form carbonates, locking carbon away for long periods. This exchange of gases made the soil a major player in Earth's carbon balance. Even at this early stage, the planet's temperature, its air composition, and its ability to support life were all being moderated by these microscopic workers underfoot. The birth of soil also changed the way water moved across the land. Before, rain would hit bare rock and flow quickly back to the sea, carrying minerals and sediment with it. Now, the new soil could absorb water, holding it in tiny pores and releasing it slowly over time. This allowed plants to survive longer between storms, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. More vegetation meant more soil, and more soil meant more vegetation. The continents were beginning to retain life rather than simply hosting it. In the lowlands, where rivers spread into deltas, these early soils grew thicker. Silt and clay, deposited by flooding, combined with organic matter to form soft, fertile ground. The first proto-ecosystems began to appear, small patches of plants, fungi, and microbes recycling nutrients in closed loops. The plants took in carbon dioxide and minerals. The fungi broke down their remains, and bacteria completed the process by releasing nutrients back into circulation. It was the first time the land had supported its own food web. However simple from above, these regions would have looked darker than their surroundings, perhaps even slightly greenish-brown. The air above them would have been more humid, carrying a faint scent of decay. In a world that had been dry and sterile for so long, these new smells were the first whispers of life's presence, the earliest version of the earthy aroma we now associate with rain on soil. Each breath of that scent was a sign of chemistry transformed by biology. The work of the fungi and microbes didn't stop at the surface. Over time, their actions began to change the composition of the upper crust itself. The minerals, most easily dissolved by organic acids like feldspars and olivine, broke down into clays. These clays, in turn, could hold onto water and nutrients far better than raw rock. As the soil matured, it became a layered structure, a darker top layer rich in organic material, a lighter sublayer of mineral particles, and beneath that, the weathered rock from which it had formed. This pattern, the basic structure of soil profiles, was established during the Silurian and remains the same today. This transformation was not confined to one region. It was happening wherever conditions allowed, along coasts, around lakes, in river valleys, even in volcanic regions where ash provided a fertile base. The fungi spread through spores carried by wind and water. The plants dispersed their own microscopic spores, which germinated in new locations when moisture and light were sufficient. The land was still mostly barren, but the patches of life were growing larger and more connected, forming corridors that stretched across continents. As soil spread, it began to influence the shape of the land. Erosion slowed and river channels stabilized. The sediments that did reach the ocean carried more organic material, feeding marine ecosystems. The cycle between land and sea was now fully integrated. What started as a thin film of microbial life had become a planetary process, linking air, water, and rock in continuous exchange. The Earth was learning how to sustain itself as a single system. It's humbling to imagine the patience involved in this transformation. The fungi and microbes worked invisibly, generation after generation, altering their surroundings without intention or awareness. Their combined effort created the foundation for everything that would follow: forests, grasslands, and eventually agriculture. Without them, the continents would have remained barren plateaus of stone, washed clean by every storm. With them, the land began to retain memory. Each layer of soil recorded the history of the environment, what grew there, what died there, what the climate was like. The Earth was beginning to write its story in sediment and decay. The partnership between fungi and plants deepened during this time. Fungal threads grew into the tissues of plant roots, forming structures that allowed the exchange of nutrients. This relationship, known today as mycorrhiza, was one of the great evolutionary breakthroughs. It gave plants access to phosphorus and nitrogen locked in minerals, while providing fungi with a steady supply of carbohydrates. Together, they formed the first underground networks, vast invisible systems of cooperation that connected multiple plants and stabilized entire ecosystems. The architecture of the modern biosphere began, not in the forests above, but in these silent webs below. As these networks expanded, they began to influence not just the surface, but the atmosphere above. Soils rich in microbes emitted gases like nitrous oxide and methane, adding new components to the air. These gases played a role in regulating temperature, much like they do today. The climate of the Silurian remained stable, in part because the biosphere had become an active participant in its balance. The planet was no longer a passive object orbiting the sun. It was a self-regulating system driven by life. The evidence for this can still be seen in ancient soils preserved within rock formations. Some contain microscopic tunnels left by fungal filaments. Others preserve the impressions of plant roots or the layering of organic-rich sediments. These traces show that by the late Silurian, soil formation had become widespread across many continents. The thin, living crust had wrapped itself around much of the world, changing its color, texture, and chemistry forever. If you could run your fingers through that early soil, it would leave a faint residue on your skin, the dust of minerals mixed with the carbon of dead plants. That same material would have carried the first nutrients inland, feeding new generations of vegetation. Each grain was part of a cycle stretching across time, rock to plant to soil to rock again. The beauty of it lies in its simplicity, in how inevitable it seems once it begins. Life makes soil, soil supports life, and together they shape the world. As the Silurian drew on, the quiet work of these architects continued without pause. Their efforts made possible everything that would come next: the rise of larger plants, the evolution of complex ecosystems, and the arrival of animals on land. The continents, once defined by stone, were now defined by substance, by layers that could grow, breathe, and die. The land had become part of the biosphere in every sense. The world's color palette changed once more. The gray and brown of bare rock gave way to deeper, richer tones. Dark soil underfoot, green vegetation along the coasts, the faint golden tint of mineral dust in the air. The planet was becoming visually alive. The transition from lifelessness to fertility was almost complete, though still invisible to any conscious observer. The processes that built soil, that turned dust into nourishment, continued in silence, unnoticed, but relentless. From above, the earth now looked softer, its edges blurred by life. The seas glittered under the sun, and the coasts were fringed with darker hues where soil and vegetation mingled. The air carried moisture inland, and clouds gathered more frequently. Rain no longer fell on empty rock, but on a surface ready to receive it, absorb it, and release it back slowly. The hydrological cycle, the beating heart of Earth's weather, had found a new rhythm. The work of the fungi and microbes had done more than build soil. They had created the conditions for stability, for continuity, for the kind of world where forests and rivers and animals could coexist. The continents were now alive in every layer, from the roots beneath to the air above. And with that, the stage was set for another transformation, one that would unfold beneath the waves, where evolution had not yet finished its work. While the continents were softening and taking their first breath of green, the oceans were still the true heart of life. The land had begun to change in subtle ways, but the sea remained the cradle where evolution did most of its work. The Silurian seas had recovered fully from the old catastrophe. They were clear, warm, and filled with potential. Coral reefs stretched for miles, anchoring themselves to the continental shelves, and between them an explosion of forms drifted, swam, or crawled. This was the world where fish learned to move, to sense, to see, and eventually to master their domain. The first fish were not new to the Silurian. Their ancestors had appeared long before, small, jawless creatures with bodies covered in bony armor. They had survived through endurance rather than dominance, grazing on plankton and detritus while hiding from predators. But during the Silurian, something began to change in their anatomy, something small but decisive. The evolution of fins was underway. At first, the fins were little more than stiff folds of skin supported by rods of cartilage. They provided stability rather than speed, helping the fish steer and balance in the water. But as the generations passed, the folds became more flexible, the supporting structures more defined. Muscles attached, control improved, and swimming became more efficient. These new fins were not just tools for movement, they were instruments of freedom. They allowed fish to explore the three-dimensional space of the ocean in ways no creature had before. Imagine looking down through the shallow waters of a Silurian reef. The light filters through in shimmering patterns, the colors muted by the haze of plankton. In the middle depths, small armored fish glide slowly between coral outcrops. Their movements are cautious, their eyes wide and alert. Each flick of a fin sends ripples through the sand below. They are primitive, yes, but in their quiet precision, you can see the beginnings of everything that would come later. Sharks, rays, bony fish, even the ancestors of amphibians and humans, all of them trace their lineage back to this moment when movement became mastery. The oceans of this time were full of opportunity. The food webs had rebuilt themselves after the great extinction, and every niche was waiting to be filled. The reefs were dense with life. Crinoids filtering the current, trilobites grazing on detritus, soft-bodied worms burrowing in the sediment. The open water, by contrast, was vast and sparsely populated, a frontier waiting for exploration. The evolution of fins allowed fish to move beyond the bottom, to venture into midwater and eventually near the surface. They became the first creatures capable of sustained, directed swimming. The Silurian fish came in many forms. Some were heavily armored, like the early ostracoderms, with bony plates protecting their heads and bodies. Their fins were simple but sturdy, helping them maneuver among rocks and plants. Others, like the anaspids, were sleeker, with lighter scales and more flexible bodies adapted for open water. There were even the tiny, smooth-skinned fish, covered in microscopic scales, the smallest vertebrates of their time. Each kind represented a different approach to survival, and evolution was testing them all simultaneously. Then came the most important innovation of all, the jaw. Somewhere among these early lineages, parts of the gill structure evolved into hinged, muscular jaws. It was a simple rearrangement of anatomy, but it changed everything. Until then, most fish had been fed by suction or filtering, limited to small particles or soft prey. With jaws, they could bite, grasp, and tear. Predation, as we know it, began here. The seas of the Silurian became a theater of new strategies, hunters and prey co-evolving in endless response to one another. The first jawed fish, known as placoderms and acanthodians, were small at first, but their impact was immense. Placoderms had heavy armor around their heads and shoulders, giving them a box-like appearance, while the rest of their bodies remained flexible. They were powerful swimmers, their jaws lined with sharp plates instead of true teeth. They hunted trilobites, small fish, and anything else they could catch. Acanthodians, sometimes called spiny sharks, were sleeker and faster, with fins supported by bony spines that may have offered protection as well as control. They're among the earliest examples of active predators with a full set of fins, pectoral, pelvic, dorsal, and tail, working in coordination. In these new swimmers, evolution had found the formula that would define vertebrate life from then on: a streamlined body, paired fins, a central backbone, and a mouth capable of grasping. From that blueprint, everything else would follow, from salmon to reptiles to mammals. The ocean, for the first time, had creatures that could chase their prey with intention, react to the environment with speed, and adapt their motion to currents and terrain. If you were to follow one of these Silurian fish through its daily life, you would see how finely balanced its world was. It would start its day near the seafloor, where the light is dim and the water cooler. It might feed on small crustaceans or worms, using suction to draw them into its mouth. When threatened, it would flick its tail, dart upward, and glide toward the cover of coral or sponge. The movement would be smooth, efficient, and almost effortless. For the first time, a vertebrate could truly control its position in three-dimensional space, rather than being carried by the current. That freedom was revolutionary. As fins improved, so did sensory systems. The early fish developed better vision. As light penetrated further into the clear Silurian seas, their eyes grew larger and more forward-facing, allowing for depth perception. They also evolved lateral lines, specialized organs along their sides that could detect vibrations in the water. This gave them awareness of movement around them, the underwater equivalent of hearing. In combination, these senses turned them into agile, responsive creatures capable of complex behavior. The oceans were no longer filled only with drifting and crawling life. They now had pursuit and evasion, strategy and awareness. The presence of these new swimmers began to reshape the ecosystem. Predators controlled populations of smaller organisms, preventing overgrowth and maintaining balance. The deaths of fish added nutrients to the seafloor, feeding decomposers and supporting coral growth. Over time, the entire marine biosphere became more dynamic, more interactive. The Silurian Ocean, once a passive landscape of filter feeders and scavengers, had become an active web of relationships, a living network driven by movement. The reefs were the focal points of this activity. They offered both refuge and risk for small fish. The dense coral provided shelter from larger hunters, but it also confined them to tight spaces where ambush was possible. Eurypterids still ruled parts of the shallow waters, using stealth and patience to capture unwary prey. The competition between these predators and the new fish drove both to evolve: speed, armor, agility, and awareness. Each advance prompted another. The equilibrium between danger and defense was constantly shifting, pushing life toward greater sophistication. Beyond the reefs, in open water, the ocean was quieter but more challenging. There, the fish had to navigate currents, temperature gradients, and pressure changes. Fins allowed them to maintain stability in this variable environment, to hover in place or move deliberately in any direction. Some species evolved elongated tails that gave them propulsion. Others used wide pectoral fins to glide. The diversity of body shapes we see today, from flattened rays to torpedo-like tuna, all began with these experiments in motion during the Silurian. The internal anatomy of fish was also evolving. Their skeletons, once entirely cartilaginous, began to include bone. This change provided a stronger framework for muscle attachment and protection. Bone, unlike cartilage, could store minerals and repair itself. It represented another layer of biological innovation, a living material shaped by the needs of movement and endurance. As bone spread through vertebrate evolution, it would form not only skeletons, but also teeth, scales, and armor. The story of bones is the story of adaptation, written in calcium and phosphate. This newfound mobility had far-reaching effects on evolution beyond the ocean. The success of fish led to the diversification of vertebrates in every habitat. Over tens of millions of years, their descendants would move into rivers, lakes, and eventually onto land. But in the Silurian, none of that had happened yet. What mattered now was that movement itself had been mastered. The seas had their first true swimmers, and the pattern of life would never be the same. It's remarkable how much this transformation depended on subtle changes in structure. A few new muscles, a shift in cartilage, a joint that allowed a wider range of motion. From these small beginnings came the architecture of vertebrate anatomy. Each improvement in mobility opened new ecological opportunities. Fish that could move faster caught more prey. Fish that could maneuver better avoided predators. Over time, these advantages accumulated, and the diversity of species expanded dramatically. The fossil record of the Silurian preserves these transitions beautifully. In rocks from Europe, North America, and China, paleontologists have found remains of early jawed fish with paired fins, eyes on the sides of their heads, and traces of scales covering their bodies. Some of these fossils are so well preserved that the fine details of their fins and muscles can still be studied under microscopes. Each specimen captures a step in evolution, the gradual shift from passive drift to active motion. The presence of so many small, agile fish also changed the chemistry of the ocean. As they fed and excreted waste, they helped recycle nutrients from the surface to the depths. This vertical mixing enriched deep waters and sustained plankton growth above. The entire marine food web became more efficient, with energy moving through it faster and more effectively. The emergence of fins had consequences far beyond locomotion. It reshaped the flow of life itself. From above, if you could look down on the Silurian Ocean, you would see countless glimmers of motion beneath the surface. Schools of small fish darting in coordinated waves, their scales catching the sunlight. Larger predators patrolling the edges of reefs. The scene would look familiar in some ways, the same patterns of life we still see today in coral seas and coastal shallows, yet quieter, slower, less crowded. It was the prototype of all future oceans. This was also a time of experimentation with form. Some fish developed heavy armor and thick bodies for defense. Others became sleek and agile for pursuit. Nature was testing what worked best. Over millions of years, the most successful designs would persist, refined by the pressure of survival. The innovation of fins was not a single event, but a branching process, leading to an entire lineage of possibilities. The oceans had become a workshop of evolution, where movement was the measure of life. As these creatures swam through their ancient seas, they carried with them the seeds of future worlds. Every flick of a fin, every adaptation to current and tide, was a rehearsal for what would come later. When their descendants finally ventured onto land, they would transform fins into limbs, scales into skin, gills into lungs. The lineage that began in these warm Silurian waters would walk, fly, and think millions of years later. But for now, in this quiet age, they simply swam, graceful, efficient, and alive. The reefs below them grew steadily, their corals forming intricate lattices of stone. The light filtered down through layers of turquoise water, illuminating a world in motion. Tiny fish darted through the coral's branches. Larger ones cruised above, their shadows rippling across the sand. The water was filled with oxygen, clear and vibrant. The planet had found its equilibrium again. The sea was, once more, the engine of evolution, and from its depths, everything that followed would rise. The age of fish had begun quietly, without announcement or spectacle, in waters that shimmered with life. The first fins cut through those waters like signatures on a blank page, writing the next chapter of Earth's story in waves and scales. And as the seas thrived, the surface above them was changing too, not just in soil or air, but in the reefs themselves, where entire ecosystems were becoming architectural wonders of living stone. Deep beneath the soft waves of the Silurian seas, whole landscapes were being built, not by tectonic force or volcanic eruption, but by living organisms. The reefs of this time were vast and intricate, stretching across shallow shelves and archipelagos that no longer exist. They were not made of the same corals that fill tropical oceans today, but of their ancient ancestors. Colonies of simple, soft-bodied polyps encased in stony skeletons, working together with quiet precision. Each one was tiny, no larger than a fingertip. Yet collectively, they shaped the structure of entire coastlines. From the surface, these reefs would have looked like shimmering patches beneath the water, light breaking into 1,000 fragments over their tops. But beneath, they were cities, layered, crowded, and full of movement. Every surface was occupied, every crevice hid something living. Corals grew upward in slow increments, each new layer built on the remains of generations before. The pace was glacial by human standards, but relentless. With time, these colonies became fortresses of limestone, massive enough to alter currents, redirect sediment, and influence local climates. Within these coral cities lived some of the most remarkable creatures of the Silurian world: crinoids, brachiopods, trilobites, early mollusks, and countless smaller invertebrates that would one day give rise to the vast diversity of marine life. Crinoids, in particular, stood out. They were animals, though they looked like plants. Long stalks anchored to the reef or sea floor, topped with feathery arms that opened like flowers. When the current passed through, those arms waved rhythmically, catching microscopic food from the water. Thousands of them could fill an area the size of a modern meadow, their delicate movements swaying in unison like grass in a breeze. These were the crinoid forests of the Silurian, Slow, silent, and spectacular. In their presence, the water was never still. Each arm caught particles of plankton and detritus, feeding not just themselves, but the system as a whole. Their waste fell to the seafloor, where it nourished other creatures. Their bodies, when they died, added to the sediment, contributing calcium and organic matter that built new layers of reef. The cycle of growth and decay here was perfect. Everything returned to the structure that sustained it. Between the crinoid forests and coral ridges, small fish wove in, their scales glinting under filtered sunlight. Trilobites crawled along the sand, stirring up fine clouds that settled again like dust on stone. Worms tunneled through the soft sediment, leaving winding trails that crisscrossed the bottom. Each movement was slow but constant, an endless reshaping of the seabed that kept the ecosystem alive. The reef was not a static monument. It was a living machine, powered by motion and time. These reefs were some of the largest biological constructions the planet had ever seen up to that point. In some regions, they extended for hundreds of kilometers along continental shelves. They acted as breakwaters, calming the waves that struck the shorelines behind them. They created lagoons of still water where delicate organisms could thrive, protected from the open sea. In those sheltered spaces, new species evolved: small, shelled animals, soft-bodied filter feeders, early crustaceans. Diversity flourished in the safety of the coral shadows. The composition of the reefs themselves reflected the chemistry of the ocean. During the Silurian, the seas were rich in calcium and magnesium, perfect for building skeletons and shells. The water was warm and clear, with stable salinity and gentle currents. In such conditions, life had the opportunity to focus on architecture. The reefs grew upward, limited only by the depth of sunlight. Once they reached the surface, waves would break them apart, scattering fragments that settled elsewhere and started new colonies. This self-propagating process allowed reefs to spread across the planet like slow-moving tides of stone. If you were to dive into one of these ancient reefs, the scene would be mesmerizing. The light above would ripple across surfaces of cream, pink, and pale green. Corals would form branching spires and domes, some shaped like honeycombs, others like coiled tubes. Crinoids would rise between them like underwater ferns, their arms extended. Small fish would dart through narrow passages, and eurypterids, the sea scorpions, would patrol the edges, waiting for prey to venture too far. The water would hum with life, not in sound, but in motion, a constant choreography of feeding, growing, and drifting. Many of these species lived symbiotically. Corals hosted microscopic algae within their tissues, the algae using sunlight to produce energy while sharing nutrients with their hosts. This partnership, which continues in modern reefs, allowed them to grow faster and survive in nutrient-poor water. Crinoids, too, often formed clusters that enhanced water flow, making it easier to capture food. The reef was a network of cooperation as much as competition, every organism dependent on countless others. The stability of the Silurian climate allowed these systems to flourish for millions of years. Storms were frequent, but not catastrophic. The temperatures stayed within a narrow range, avoiding the extremes that could destroy coral growth. The seas were warmest near the equator, and it was there that the largest reefs formed, belts of living limestone encircling the planet like garlands. Some of these would later become mountain ranges, raised high by continental collisions. The cliffs and hills of modern Earth still hold the skeletons of those ancient reefs, silent reminders of oceans long vanished. The presence of reefs did more than support marine life. It also influenced the atmosphere. As corals built their skeletons from calcium carbonate, they absorbed carbon dioxide from seawater. This process indirectly removed carbon from the air, contributing to the gradual cooling of the planet. The balance between reef growth and volcanic activity helped regulate climate on a global scale. Once again, life was shaping the environment that sustained it. Over time, sediments accumulated around the reefs, burying parts of them and preserving them as limestone. These deposits recorded every stage of growth: layers of coral, shells, and crinoid stems compressed into solid rock. Within those layers are fossils that tell the story of an entire ecosystem. Some show coral polyps frozen in mid-growth, their chambers perfectly preserved. Others contain the stems of crinoids, still aligned in the direction of ancient currents. Together, they offer a glimpse into a world that was as complex and interdependent as any modern ocean. In these coral kingdoms, even decay had purpose. When parts of the reef died, scavengers moved in to feed on the remains. Bacteria and fungi broke down organic matter, releasing nutrients that fueled new growth. The dead structures provided a base for young corals to attach and begin again. The reef was a self-renewing system, thriving on its own cycles of birth and erosion. In that sense, it mirrored the planet itself, constantly changing, never truly still. The diversity of creatures within the reefs was astonishing for its time. There were encrusting sponges that formed layers over coral skeletons. There were gastropods with spiral shells, grazing on microbial films, brachiopods clustered in dense patches, filtering food with delicate tentacles, cephalopods and the ancestors of squid and octopuses, hovering in open water, their tentacles exploring with cautious grace. Even early fish found safety here, laying eggs among the coral branches and feeding on the abundance of small prey. The reef was a complete ecosystem, balanced and vibrant. For millions of years, these coral and crinoid habitats dominated the shallow seas, their expansion limited only by sea level and sunlight. When the tides receded during glacial periods, reefs were exposed and died. When the waters rose again, they grew anew. This rhythm created alternating bands of reef and sediment in the geological record, each one a snapshot of climate and life interacting. If you could watch this process unfold on a timescale faster than your own, it would look like breathing, reefs rising, dying, and rebuilding in cycles lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Each pulse added new layers of limestone, thickening the crust of the planet. The living reefs acted like filters for the ocean, clarifying the water, enriching it with oxygen, and stabilizing its chemistry. The seas of the Silurian were clean and productive because of them. The beauty of these underwater landscapes was functional, not ornamental. Every curve and branch of coral served a purpose: to catch light, to resist waves, to create space for life. The geometry of the reef was mathematics in motion, shaped by natural forces and biological persistence. Long before art, before architecture, before design, nature had already built structures of breathtaking intricacy, each one the work of uncountable organisms acting in concert. The influence of the reefs extended far beyond the sea. The carbon they stored would one day become the limestone that humans would quarry for buildings, the marble that artists would carve, the rock that would form mountains and cliffs. The air we breathe today still carries traces of the balance they maintained. Their work was not temporary, it was foundational. They turned chemistry into permanence, biology into geology. By the end of the Silurian, the coral reefs had reached their greatest extent so far in Earth's history. They supported more life than any other habitat of the time. The crinoid forests swayed gently above them. The fish patrolled their edges, and the currents carried spores and larvae from one colony to the next, ensuring the continuity of life across oceans. The Earth had entered a state of equilibrium, warm, wet, oxygen-rich, and full of movement. Yet even in this stability, change was on the horizon. The continents were drifting again, closing the shallow seas in some places and opening new ones in others. Volcanic activity was stirring, sending fresh nutrients into the water. The conditions that had favored the reefs would not last forever, but for now, they flourished in calm perfection. From the perspective of a single coral polyp, time was meaningless. It grew, divided, and died, unaware that it was building a monument to its own persistence. But taken together, these tiny lives transformed the face of the planet. They created the limestone that would one day form cliffs above the sea, the stone that would hold fossils of fish, the foundation for the very land on which forests would grow. The story of the reefs is the story of how life began to sculpt the earth on a grand scale. In those ancient seas, under a sky newly rich with oxygen, the coral kingdoms and crinoid forests continued their slow dance. Their movement was gentle, but their impact was immense. The water shimmered with light reflected from living stone, and the currents carried the soft rustle of life, expanding in every direction. The Silurian world was alive in every layer, from the soil of the continents to the forests beneath the waves. And as the reefs rose higher and the fish swam faster, the world beyond them was beginning to stir once more. The continents were shifting, the air thickening, and the tides of the planet preparing for another quiet transformation, one that would carry life even closer to the land it had only just begun to touch. The earth had grown comfortable again. For millions of years, the seas had been calm, the reefs abundant, the air stable, the continents steady in their drift. But nothing on this planet remained still for long. The very processes that had given rise to stability, plate movement, erosion, biological growth, were also preparing to change it. In the Silurian world, transition was not an event. It was a rhythm. The tides rose and fell, the continents shifted inch by inch, and in the quiet intervals between these motions, life adjusted its course. The coral kingdoms that had spread so widely across the shallow seas began to encounter new challenges. As continents drifted closer together, the patterns of ocean currents changed. What had once been broad, open channels between land masses narrowed into straits and gulfs. These constrictions affected water temperature, salinity, and circulation. Reefs that had thrived in one place began to decline as their environment shifted, while new reefs rose elsewhere. The living architecture of the ocean was constantly rebuilding itself in response to the slow reshaping of the Earth's surface. In some regions, the sea level began to fluctuate more dramatically. Glacial cycles at the poles, though mild compared to earlier ages, caused the waters to retreat and return over spans of thousands of years. Each withdrawal exposed parts of the continental shelf, killing coral and leaving the limestone skeletons bare. Each advance drowned the coasts again, creating new habitats for colonization. The pattern left alternating layers of reef and sediment, a record of expansion and retreat written into stone. The climate, though generally stable, was also beginning to show subtle changes. The atmosphere, now richer in oxygen and lower in carbon dioxide, allowed for cooler temperatures in some areas. Rainfall increased, feeding rivers that carved deep valleys into the continents. These rivers carried sediment to the sea, clouding the water near coasts and changing the chemistry of shallow habitats. For the organisms that lived there, adaptation was the only option. Some coral species learned to tolerate murkier water. Others gave way to different builders like stromatoporoids, sponge-like creatures that formed massive, solid reefs. The ecosystems of the Silurian were flexible, capable of reorganization in the face of change. While the seas adjusted, the land continued its slow evolution toward greenness. The early soils thickened, roots penetrated deeper, and plant life spread farther inland. The coasts became lined with low mats of vegetation, their dark patches marking the border between ocean and continent. These plants, in turn, affected the flow of nutrients into the water. They trapped sediment and absorbed minerals, filtering the runoff before it reached the sea. The clarity of near-shore waters improved, creating conditions where reefs could rebuild after each disturbance. The connection between land and ocean had never been stronger. Every pulse of growth or erosion on one side influenced the other. Continental movement during this time was shaping the geography of the planet. We know the northern landmasses, Laurentia, Baltica, and Avalonia, were drifting toward each other, slowly closing the ocean that separated them. When they eventually collided, they would form a new supercontinent and raise mountains where seafloors had once been. The first of these collisions began during the late Silurian, pushing up ranges that altered wind patterns and rainfall. The higher terrain created rain shadows and dry basins, places where plants struggled and rivers shifted course. The geography of life was being rewritten. Volcanic activity accompanied this tectonic restlessness. Ash and gases entered the atmosphere, influencing both climate and ocean chemistry. The ash, rich in minerals, settled into the water and fertilized, plankton bloomed. These microscopic organisms captured carbon dioxide and produced oxygen, feeding into the global cycles that balance the air. In some regions, volcanic islands formed chains across the sea, providing new surfaces for colonization by plants and corals alike. The world was not in chaos, it was in motion, a planet in the process of reimagining its layout. For the creatures of the Silurian seas, these transitions meant adaptation and opportunity. The fish that had learned to use fins for control and jaws for hunting found themselves in changing waters with new environments to explore. Some species moved into deeper zones, where light was dim but stability greater. Others thrived in the shallows, taking advantage of the reef's shifting boundaries. The ecosystems that emerged were complex and dynamic, each species responding to a web of changes that connected sky and sea. The reefs themselves continued to be centers of life, even as they migrated with the tides. Coral polyps grew over the remains of their ancestors, filling gaps and building higher. Crinoids anchored themselves to the new surfaces, filtering the nutrient-rich currents stirred up by changing seas. Trilobites, ever adaptable, remained plentiful, evolving new forms suited to different depths and diets. Some became burrowers, living in the soft sediment of lagoons. Others roamed the open shelves, scavenging for food. Their diversity was a testament to the flexibility of life in an unstable world. The interaction between sea and sky also intensified. The atmosphere, now dense with oxygen, allowed for richer biological activity in shallow waters. Oxygen levels in the ocean rose, supporting larger animals and faster metabolisms. The circulation of nutrients between surface and depth became more efficient. Every storm mixed the layers of water, distributing oxygen downward and bringing minerals upward. The ocean became a more evenly balanced environment, less prone to stagnation. This was the early formation of the global oceanic system that would persist into modern times. The coasts, meanwhile, were beginning to look familiar in shape, if not in detail. Estuaries formed where rivers met the sea, their waters mixing in gradients of salt and fresh. These brackish zones were harsh but fertile, filled with life adapted to fluctuation. Simple arthropods and worms thrived there, feeding on organic debris washed down from the land. Early fish ventured into these shallow waters, tolerating the variable salinity. They didn't stay long, but each visit was a step toward future colonization of freshwater environments. The first inland ecosystems were forming at the fringes of the tides. If you stood on one of those coasts during this time, the world before you would look both alien and alive. The land behind would be low and greenish-brown, dotted with mats of plants and small streams winding toward the sea. The air would feel moist and heavy, carrying the scent of salt and soil. The horizon would shimmer where sunlight struck the water. You would see reefs rising beneath the surface, pale and patterned, their tops just visible as the waves rolled over them. In the distance, dark plumes might rise from a volcanic island. The sound would be constant, wind, surf, and the faint hiss of rain falling on the sea. It would feel like a living equilibrium, every part of the world connected by invisible threads. This era of transition also brought new forms of interaction among living things. As fish became faster and predators more skilled, prey species evolved defenses. Some developed tougher scales, others adopted behaviors like schooling, moving in coordinated groups to confuse hunters. These social patterns were new to evolution, the beginnings of collective behavior in animals. Cooperation and competition were balancing forces now, shaping biology in equal measure. The rise of more complex food webs also meant more waste, more decay, and therefore more recycling. Decomposers in the sediments multiplied, breaking down organic matter and returning nutrients to the system. The ocean was becoming self-sustaining on a grander scale. The boundaries between life and environment blurred further. Every death enriched the sea. Every storm mixed it back into circulation. The Silurian biosphere was learning to reuse itself efficiently. Even the reefs, those vast structures of stone and life, depended on this cycle. When storms or temperature changes destroyed sections of coral, the debris became substrate for new colonies. The fragments of old reefs seeded the formation of new ones elsewhere. The process was endless and patient. The reefs migrated across the seafloor like slow-moving continents of their own, rebuilding themselves wherever conditions allowed. The same pattern appeared on land. The plants that colonized new ground altered it as they grew, creating microclimates that favored more growth. As they spread inland, they trapped water, moderated temperature, and supported fungi and microbes. In their wake, new soil formed. The green line along the coast thickened and advanced. Each patch of vegetation was both an effect of past change and a cause of future change. The land and sea were locked in a dialogue that would continue for the rest of the Earth's history. The energy driving all of this was subtle but constant. The slow heat of the Earth's interior moving continents, the steady radiation of the sun feeding photosynthesis, the endless pull of gravity shaping tides. Each force interacted with the others, creating rhythms that life could sense and adapt to. The tides themselves, rising and falling under the influence of the moon, sculpted the edges of continents, carrying seeds, spores, and nutrients between habitats. The lunar cycle had become an invisible metronome for evolution. When viewed over geological time, the Silurian appears as a period of balance. But that balance was built on movement. It was not a still world, but a dynamic one, its calm the result of constant adjustment. Every system, ocean currents, atmospheric gases, biological populations, shifted in response to feedback from the others. It was this capacity for adjustment that allowed life to thrive through transition rather than succumb to it. The Earth was learning stability through motion. In the oceans, the interplay of tides and currents created new opportunities for species to specialize. Some fish adapted to the surge zones near reefs, where water pressure changed with every wave. Others moved into quieter depths, developing sensory organs to detect movement in near darkness. Trilobites diversified further, their eyes evolving to suit different light conditions. The Silurian was not a time of spectacular extinction or explosion. It was a time of refinement, of ecosystems perfecting themselves through continuous change. Each pulse of the tide carried with it traces of everything the world had become. Oxygen from plants, sediment from rivers, spores from land, and larvae from reefs. The movement of water connected every part of the biosphere. Even the smallest current had meaning. In its rise and fall, the planet found its rhythm, one that would echo through every future age. And as the continents continued to drift closer, the stage was being set for yet another transformation. The air was ready, the soil thickening, the sea full of creatures capable of exploring beyond it. Soon, life would cross a threshold once thought impossible, to stand, however briefly, upon the land and begin a new kind of existence. But for now, the tides ruled everything, carrying the memory of all that had been and the promise of all that was still to come. There comes a point in every story of evolution when an impossible idea becomes a simple fact. For billions of years, life had belonged to the water. Every breath, every movement, every act of survival took place beneath the surface. The ocean had provided everything: protection, buoyancy, and nourishment. To leave it even briefly was to risk death. Yet in the late Silurian, on coasts scattered across the warming continents, some creatures began to test that boundary. They did not know they were doing anything extraordinary. They were simply following food, shelter, or instinct. But in doing so, they began the long transition from sea to land. The first steps were small, hesitant, and almost accidental. Along the edges of tidal flats where the water retreated each day, early arthropods ventured onto damp ground. These were not insects yet, but their distant ancestors, millipede-like detritivores, small, scorpion-shaped hunters, and other segmented creatures adapted to crawling over soft sediment. They were already armored with exoskeletons that kept their bodies from collapsing when the water withdrew. Some of them could tolerate brief exposure to air by trapping moisture under their shells or absorbing oxygen directly through damp tissues. The tides gave them opportunity and time. Twice a day, the sea revealed new territory, and with each retreat, the land invited exploration. In those first ventures, survival depended on moisture. The air was still harsh and thin, the sun intense, the wind unfiltered. Away from the safety of the sea, bodies could dry out within minutes. The pioneers clung to the wettest areas, patches of algae, puddles left by the tide, and cracks in the rocks where water lingered. Each journey inland was short, cautious, and costly. Many died where they crawled, but a few endured long enough to feed, breed, or return to the sea. And from those survivors, a new pattern began. The coastlines of the Silurian were the perfect training ground for this kind of experimentation. The tides left vast expanses of exposed mud each day, covered with microorganisms, decaying plants, and other organic matter. For scavengers and grazers, this was an irresistible resource. The earliest land-dwelling arthropods likely fed on these mats of detritus and algae. They didn't need to stay long, just long enough to eat before the tide returned. Over generations, they developed tougher exoskeletons, stronger limbs for crawling, and simple respiratory systems capable of functioning in air. What had started as an accident was turning into adaptation. The same process was happening in countless places, driven by small evolutionary pressures rather than sudden leaps. Each generation pushed a little farther, stayed a little longer, and left a little more evidence behind. Fossilized trackways from the late Silurian and early Devonian show the impressions of multiple-legged creatures moving across damp sediment. Some of these trails lead directly from water channels onto dry surfaces. The pattern suggests deliberate movement, not mere stranding. These were the footprints of life crossing a boundary that had defined the planet since its beginning. The land they found was far from inviting. The air was warmer now, with higher oxygen levels than before, but the terrain was still barren and unstable. The soil was thin and the vegetation low. Small mats of moss-like plants and patches of early vascular plants provided pockets of shade and moisture, but vast areas remained bare, rock and sand. There were no forests, no true rivers, no animal sounds. The pioneers moved across a silent, still landscape. Every gust of wind was a challenge. Every stretch of exposed ground is a risk. And yet, for reasons that had little to do with awareness, they kept returning. The advantages of these short excursions were real. On land, there were no aquatic predators, no eurypterids, no fish, no lurking threats from below. For small, vulnerable species, even a brief escape to the surface provided safety. The shallows were crowded and competitive. The shore offered space. The air carried oxygen at a higher concentration than water, which meant that for those capable of using it, metabolism could run faster and activity could increase. The trade-off was desiccation, but evolution was already experimenting with ways to manage that balance. Insects would not yet exist for tens of millions of years, but their ancestors were beginning to take shape in these same environments. The arthropods that first colonized land were setting the biological groundwork for everything that would follow. Exoskeletons with waxy coatings to retain moisture-jointed legs for movement over uneven ground, and tracheal tubes that could deliver air directly to internal tissues. Each of these features would later define terrestrial arthropods. But in the Silurian, they were still forming, still imperfect, still half-suited to a world that didn't yet belong to them. The plants that had begun to colonize the land played a crucial role in this process. They provided both shelter and structure. Their small bodies created shade and retained moisture, and their decaying remains formed a soft surface over the bare rock. This primitive soil made it easier for animals to move and rest without drying out. It also provided food, detritus, microbes and fungi that grew among the plants. Wherever vegetation spread, life followed. And wherever life gathered, the soil deepened, creating a feedback loop of colonization. The first ecosystems on land were emerging, small but sustainable. In this growing network of life, fungi continued to serve as intermediaries. They decomposed dead plants, recycling nutrients and creating pockets of organic material that held water. They connected plants through underground filaments, sharing resources and stabilizing the soil. For the animals venturing onto land, these fungal networks shaped the terrain itself, turning it from dust into something that could support movement and life. The invisible world beneath the surface was every bit as important as the one above. The air was becoming more complex too. The increase in oxygen and the spread of vegetation created a faint, earthy scent that would have been entirely new in Earth's history. It was the smell of decomposition and growth combined, a sign that the planet's chemistry was changing, not just in the oceans, but on the surface itself. Every rainfall washed organic compounds into rivers, which carried them back to the sea, feeding plankton and reefs. The cycles of land and ocean were now inseparable. For the first creatures to walk on land, the senses themselves had to adjust. Vision changed first. Underwater, light is scattered and filtered. On land, it is sharp and direct. Arthropods that could regulate the intensity of light entering their eyes had an advantage. Those with simple lenses evolved into compound eyes capable of detecting both motion and brightness. Hearing and smell would come later, but touch was immediate. On solid ground, vibration replaced current as the language of awareness. Every step was felt through the body. The tremor of the air, the rumble of wind, the shifting of sand beneath the legs. Movement itself became a new form of communication. Some of the early terrestrial arthropods likely carried their eggs or young with them, ensuring survival between tides. Others laid eggs in damp soil, letting the next generation hatch directly on land. These behaviors marked another step toward independence from the ocean. Reproduction no longer required immersion, only moisture. Over millions of years, this gradual separation would lead to fully terrestrial life cycles. By the end of the Silurian, a few species could probably complete their entire lives without returning to the sea, though they would never venture far from its edge. The fossil record preserves this moment in subtle traces rather than clear remains. The delicate bodies of these creatures rarely fossilized well on land, where decay and erosion were rapid. But their footprints, burrows, and molted exoskeletons remain in fine layers of sediment. In some formations, You can see the tracks of multiple individuals moving in parallel, as if following the same tidal line. In others, a single trail begins in water and ends abruptly in dry sediment, perhaps the last steps of an animal that ventured too far. These silent records are among the most evocative fossils we have, the evidence of curiosity made permanent in stone. Each step onto land represented a small victory over the constraints of biology. It was not an exodus, but an exploration, driven by necessity and chance. The air was new, the gravity heavier, the landscape uncertain. Yet life adapted, because it always does, not through foresight, but through persistence. The same evolutionary processes that had shaped fins into instruments of movement in the sea were now shaping legs for movement on land. The continuity between these worlds was unbroken. Evolution didn't leap, it extended. The Silurian coasts must have been remarkable places, the meeting points of two worlds. The tides brought nutrients, the rivers brought sediment, and the air brought oxygen. Every cycle reinforced the others. The boundary between land and sea was no longer a wall, but a gradient. Amphibious life, creatures capable of surviving in both realms, began to define that gradient. They were the connectors, the intermediaries, the first representatives of what would one day become a fully terrestrial biosphere. The presence of these animals affected the land itself. Their movements mixed the soil, their burrows aerated it, and their waste added organic material. In the simplest sense, they were gardeners, unknowingly preparing the terrain for future generations. Each track pressed into wet sand created a depression that collected water and seeds. Each decaying body returned nutrients to the ground. The shaping of Earth's surface had gained new participants. The expansion of life onto land also changed the atmosphere's chemistry further. As plants and soil microbes continued to produce oxygen and absorb carbon dioxide, the balance tipped toward cooler conditions. Clouds became thicker, rainfall more regular. The planet's hydrological cycle stabilized. The climate of the late Silurian was humid and warm, but less extreme than before. This steadiness provided the continuity evolution needed to continue its slow march inland. If you stood in one of these ancient coastal regions, perhaps at the edge of a shallow lagoon, you might witness the quiet rhythm of this transformation. The tide would withdraw, leaving the wet sand shining under a hazy sun. Small arthropods would emerge, their shells glinting as they scuttled across the exposed flats. They would stop, probe the surface with antennae, and continue forward, their legs leaving faint, symmetrical prints. Some would pause at the base of a rock or a patch of moss, feeding briefly before returning toward the retreating water. The scene would last only minutes before the tide rolled back in, erasing most of the evidence, but enough would remain for time to record it. This daily rhythm, repeated over countless generations, was how the land became inhabited. There was no singular moment, no first creature to conquer the shore. It was a continuum, the steady blending of two worlds until the boundary between them dissolved. The ocean remained the source of life, but the land was becoming its extension, a place where energy and opportunity existed in new forms. The earth was quieter then than it would ever be again. The land had no birds, no insects, no mammalian footsteps. Only the faint clicking of arthropod limbs and the whisper of wind across moss broke the silence. Yet, in that stillness, everything was changing. The first steps had been taken. The direction was irreversible. Life had found a way to stand, however briefly, on the dry skin of the planet. And with each return to the sea, it carried a little more adaptation, a little more resilience, a little more of what it needed to make the land its home. The world was no longer divided by the waterline. The line itself was shifting, alive with movement. From the smallest microbes in the soil to the arthropods crawling over stone, To the plants that held fast against the wind, the entire surface of the earth was now engaged in a single conversation. The ocean still ruled, but it had begun to share. The world that formed during the Silurian did not disappear. It sank, hardened, folded, and rose again. The quiet seas that had once stretched across the continents turned into stone, and the traces of that age now lie buried beneath fields, mountains, and cities. When you walk across the ground, you're moving over the remains of that forgotten world. A planet that once breathed differently, sounded differently, and saw the first outlines of the world we know. Every ridge, every cliff, every grain of limestone beneath the surface holds a memory of that time. The echoes of the Silurian are not distant. They're under our feet. The rocks of this period are soft in color, pale gray, tan, and faintly pink, but dense with history. Layer after layer of ancient sediment holds the signatures of reefs, tidal flats, and shallow seas that once covered most of the land. In these layers, coral colonies are frozen in mid-growth. Crinoid stems cut cleanly through their centers, shells embedded where they fell millions of years before the first vertebrate walked on shore. They are more than fossils. They are pages from a book the planet wrote in limestone, each one describing a time when the Earth was simpler, but already building toward complexity. If you look closely at a piece of Silurian limestone, you can often see the intricate structure of its makers. Some layers are filled with the honeycomb patterns of corals, others with circular impressions from crinoids. The rock itself is made almost entirely of what was once alive, the compressed calcium carbonate of shells and skeletons. It is solidified biology. In a sense, it is the petrified memory of the ocean. When rain falls on it today, it dissolves slightly, releasing tiny traces of ancient carbon back into the air. The cycle continues long after the life that began it has vanished. Many of the world's most famous landscapes are built from Silurian stone. The cliffs along parts of Britain and Scandinavia, the hills of eastern North America, and sections of China and Australia all contain remnants of these ancient reefs. Some have been raised high above sea level by tectonic force, exposed to air for the first time in hundreds of millions of years. What were once coral gardens now form the spines of mountains. It is difficult to imagine the transformation, the slow lift of seabed into the summit. But the evidence is there in every fossil, every mineral layer. The ocean never really leaves. It just changes shape. Inside those rocks, the chemistry of life remains. Carbon trapped by ancient plants and shells still lies locked within, sometimes in the form of graphite, sometimes as organic residue invisible to the naked eye. That carbon once flowed through living cells, through the breath of algae and the decay of fungi. When we burn limestone to make cement or mine it for construction, we are releasing that stored life back into the atmosphere. The past is never inert. It waits quietly, ready to join the cycles of the present again. The echo of the Silurian is also in the air we breathe. The oxygen we depend on is part of a balance first established during that time. Before the rise of plants on land, oxygen levels fluctuated wildly. The Silurians stabilized them, the roots that broke rock, the microbes that formed soil, the reefs that drew down carbon. All of these processes worked together to create an atmosphere that could support larger and more active life. That balance still holds. The percentage of oxygen in the air, around 21%, is a legacy of that ancient adjustment. Every breath you take continues a rhythm that began when the world first turned green. Even the shape of continents we know today was influenced by the Silurian movement. The slow collision of land masses that began in that era would eventually form new supercontinents and mountain ranges. Those mountains, in turn, altered rainfall and erosion patterns, determining where soil accumulated and where deserts formed. The Silurian was the beginning of large-scale geological cooperation, life influencing rock, rock influencing air, air influencing life. The feedback loops that keep Earth stable all trace back to that age when complexity first spread across the surface. The fossils from this period tell stories that science continues to uncover. Some of them are microscopic spores of early land plants, preserved in fine sediment, each a perfect sphere with surface textures still visible. Others are large, complete coral heads, shells of brachiopods, and trilobites preserved in lifelike poses. Each fossil marks a moment in the planet's long memory. They are not just objects, but evidence of time's continuity, proof that the world we walk on has lived many lives before ours. When geologists study these formations, they see more than rock. They see sequences of events. Extinction, recovery, migration, and adaptation, all layered together in the thickness of a few meters. A single outcrop might represent 10 million years of history compressed into a pattern of stone. The delicate laminations in shale, the crossbedding in sandstone, the ripple marks fossilized in limestone, each one a whisper of tides long vanished. In that sense, the ground beneath us is not silent. It is a record, still speaking if you know how to listen. Many of the minerals that nourish life today originated from the chemical processes that began in the Silurian. The breakdown of rock by roots and microbes released nutrients that would eventually become part of the global soil system. Phosphorus, calcium, and iron cycles, essential to every living cell, all began their modern pathways then. The slow weathering of these minerals continues to feed forests and oceans alike. Every handful of soil, every fertile plain, carries the inheritance of those early interactions between rock and life. There is a strange continuity in how the past remains active in the present. The oxygen produced by Silurian plants allowed fish to grow larger and faster, which in turn enriched the seafloor when they died, which helped form the limestone that now shapes our landscapes. That same oxygen allowed early arthropods to survive on land, creating soil that still supports vegetation. Every part of the modern world is a direct continuation of those feedback systems. The echoes beneath our feet are not faint. They form the foundation of everything above them. Sometimes, when you stand near a limestone cliff or the mouth of an old quarry, you can feel the scale of time it represents. The rock rises in layers, each marking a different rhythm of sedimentation. The lower strata are dense and massive, formed when the ocean was deep. The upper ones are thinner, more delicate, built during the shallow, reef-filled stages. Touching that stone is like touching a moment when the world was almost entirely sea. The ridges under your fingers might once have been coral walls, or the stem of a crinoid, waving gently in a current. The line between the living and the non-living becomes indistinguishable. The fossils of early land plants, though small, tell their own part of the story. Their remains are often found near ancient riverbeds or lake margins, places where soil and sediment built up quickly enough to preserve them. Under a microscope, their structures show the beginnings of vascular systems, the tiny tubes that would one day carry water up the tallest trees. Those same tubes, now fossilized, are the ancestors of every stem, leaf, and root in modern vegetation. They are the reason we have forests, crops, and shade. The first roots that broke the Silurian stone still echo in the living roots that hold our soil today. Even the sense of a landscape we carry as humans, the way we perceive mountains, valleys, and horizons, is shaped by geological inheritance. The hills we see are built from uplifted reefs. The fertile plains we farm are made of weathered sediments from ancient seas. The minerals in our bones, the oxygen in our blood, the carbon in our cells, all of them come from processes that began during the Silurian. We are, quite literally, walking extensions of that age. The boundary between past and present does not exist in matter, only in memory. In caves carved into limestone, water continues to write its slow story. Drop by drop, It dissolves the stone, carries it downward, and redeposits it as stalactites and stalagmites. Each formation grows a fraction of a millimeter each year. Over millennia, they form columns, walls, and chambers, underground cathedrals built from the remnants of ancient reefs. When you stand in such a place, surrounded by the echoes of dripping water, you're hearing the last faint heartbeat of the Silurian Ocean, still resonating through the crust of the earth. The same materials that once formed coral skeletons now serve as aquifers, storing fresh water deep below the surface. These reservoirs provide water for ecosystems and people alike. Every drop that rises from a limestone spring has passed through rock formed in those ancient seas. It carries dissolved calcium, carbonates, and traces of marine life. The line between living and geological cycles blurs again. What was once saltwater coral now holds rainwater that sustains forests and rivers. The planet's memory has become a living resource. The fossils of the Silurian are also storytellers of evolution. Among the layers of reef limestone, scientists have found evidence of the transition between jawless and jawed fish, between passive filter feeders and active hunters. Each fossil marks a small change: the angle of a fin, the structure of a gill, the pattern of scales. These details reveal how life adapted to shifting environments and pressures. They show that evolution is not an upward march, but a series of responses, a long conversation between organism and environment. That conversation began in earnest during the Silurian, and it has never stopped. When you trace your hand along a rock that holds these fossils, you're touching the surface of that conversation. It continues in every leaf that opens, every wave that breaks, every breath that draws oxygen from the air. The world does not erase its past. It integrates it. Each new layer is written on top of the old, but the words remain visible if you know how to read them. The echoes beneath our feet are not just physical. They are chemical, biological, and atmospheric. The same cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen that began then continue now. The rain that falls today carries molecules that have been part of living things countless times. The carbon in your body has almost certainly passed through the atmosphere of the Silurian, been locked in stone, and released again. Time is not a line, but a circulation, and the ground is its meeting place. In a quiet moment, standing on limestone ground, you can almost feel the depth of it. Beneath you are hundreds of meters of compacted history, the weight of oceans turned to stone. Beneath that, still older layers reaching down toward the mantle, each holding its own chapter. The scale of it defies imagination. Yet all of it participates in the same living system: the air above, the soil at the surface, the rock below, and the molten core within. All are part of the same slow respiration. The earth is still breathing as it did when coral first grew and roots first touched stone. The legacy of the Silurian lives in that breath, in the unseen link between our feet and the deep past. Every mountain that crumbles, every river that cuts through stone, every cave that opens into darkness continues the work begun by those early organisms. The coral that became limestone, the plant that became soil, the air that became stable. Together, they built the foundation of a living planet. We walk across their remains every day, unaware that the solid ground beneath us is not the end of their story, but its continuation. The echoes of that age move quietly through the world. They rise in the mineral dust, carried by wind, fall with the rain, flow in the rivers, and settle again in the sea. The cycle never stopped. The same processes that turned oceans into continents now prepare those continents to erode back into the sea. Life and rock remain locked in their ancient partnership, each shaping the other across the slow passage of time. And as the memory of the Silurian persists beneath us, the surface continues to evolve. The soil thickens, Forests begin to rise and the air grows rich and mild. The groundwork laid by roots, reefs, and tides is ready for what comes next. The transformation that will turn scattered patches of moss and water into a green, living planet. The Earth was ready. The oceans had rebuilt their life. The reefs had risen and fallen. The soil had learned to hold water, and the air was filled with oxygen. All the systems that life depended on were now connected, balanced, and stable. The groundwork laid by countless small organisms, by coral and algae and fungi and roots, was complete. What came next was not a sudden bloom, but a slow, unstoppable awakening. The planet, after billions of years of blue and grey, began to turn green. It started quietly in the low, wet places where the sea met the land. There, small plants had already taken hold, moss-like patches, simple stems, and thread-like roots gripping the surface. For millions of years, they had remained close to the water, their lives bound to moisture. But the climate had softened, the air had grown dense with oxygen, and the soil beneath them had become deep enough to hold what they needed. Now, the plants began to push outward, higher and farther from the tide. Each new generation reached a little more into the air. Their stems grew stronger, their tissues firmer. Some developed vascular systems, channels that carried water upward and nutrients downward. This single innovation allowed them to grow beyond the size of a few centimeters. They could now lift their leaves into sunlight, compete for space, and anchor themselves more deeply in the soil. The land that had been scattered with green patches began to form connected carpets. The edges of rivers darkened with vegetation. Hillsides softened and shallow valleys filled with living color. From above, the change would have been subtle, but unmistakable. The coast that once reflected light like bare stone now absorbed it. The tone of the continents deepened from pale tan to muted green. Over time, that color spread inland like a rising tide. It was not lush yet. There were no forests, no trees, no canopy. But it was life, persistent and growing. The earth was beginning to wear its first true covering of vegetation. With this spread came profound transformations. Plants captured carbon dioxide from the air and released oxygen, accelerating the balance that had begun earlier. The climate cooled slightly, rain became more regular, and the temperature of the planet stabilized even further. More clouds formed as water vapor condensed over the new greenery, shading the land and moderating the heat. Each leaf was a small machine of regulation, and together they turned the entire surface of the Earth into a living thermostat. The planet had achieved something remarkable, a form of self-control driven entirely by life. The expansion of plants also changed the sound of the world. Where the land had once been silent, now there was movement. Wind brushed against stems and leaves, creating the first rustles. Rain no longer struck bare stone, but a layer of soft vegetation, producing a deeper, more muted sound. The surface began to breathe, not just chemically but acoustically, each gust of air turning into a whisper through millions of tiny surfaces. The world was still quiet by our standards, but for the first time it had a voice. The growing vegetation anchored the soil and slowed erosion. Rivers carried less sediment, their waters running clearer. The stability of landscapes increased. Valleys began to form, gentle slopes held together by roots. The texture of the continents changed from raw and brittle to soft and structured. For the first time, the land could endure itself. It no longer vanished into the sea with every storm. The green had given it permanence. This stability opened new possibilities for life. The plants created habitats, small pockets of shade, moisture, and protection. Fungi flourished beneath them, decomposing their fallen parts and returning nutrients to the ground. Microbes multiplied in the thin films of water between soil particles. Tiny arthropods fed on the decaying material, in turn becoming food for slightly larger predators. The first simple food webs on land emerged, forming miniature ecosystems hidden in moss and mud. Each one was a complete world, sustaining itself within a few centimeters of space. The cycle of growth and decay that now defined the continents was something entirely new. Before plants, life had existed in almost constant renewal, organisms living and dying in water that dispersed their remains immediately. On land, death stayed close. When a plant died, its body became part of the soil that nurtured the next generation. Carbon, nitrogen, and minerals cycled through these local systems, enriching the land further. Life was beginning to build depth, literal, physical depth, in the form of layers of organic matter that would one day become peat, coal, and fertile earth. As vegetation spread, the atmosphere grew clearer. Dust, once lifted freely from bare rock, now settled quickly onto the surface, trapped by leaves and soil. The air became cleaner and moister, the sunlight softer. Clouds reflected more light, moderating the planet's temperature. The difference between land and sea diminished in severity. The planet was becoming a single, balanced organism. The interplay of soil, air, and water had reached a new level of harmony. The light that filtered through the growing greenery was unlike any the planet had seen before. It was dappled, scattered by leaves, tinted slightly by chlorophyll. The colors of the world changed. The greens absorbed red and blue light, reflecting their own wavelength back into the sky. The Earth's reflection, viewed from space, would have begun to change color. The blue planet had gained a new hue, faint at first but spreading. These early landscapes were still simple. The tallest plants rose no more than a meter or two, their stems thin and flexible, their leaves small, their roots shallow. But their effect was immense. They slowed wind, shaded soil, and provided humidity that allowed more life to grow. In their shadows, new species evolved to take advantage of the protection they offered. Some plants developed spores that could travel farther, spreading life inland faster than before. Others grew thicker stems, testing the limits of height. Every adaptation led to another. Evolution had found a new arena, and it was infinite. As the green spread, the rhythm of the planet shifted again. The balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide oscillated gently, maintaining the conditions for stability. Rain patterns followed the distribution of vegetation, creating local climates and distinct regions. The Earth was developing a variety, different ecosystems in different places, each shaped by its geography and species. It was the beginning of ecological diversity, the slow unfolding of complexity that would eventually fill every corner of the world. The oceans, too, felt the change. The rivers that flowed from the newly green continents carried nutrients and organic matter into the sea, feeding plankton and coral. The cycle of life had expanded beyond boundaries. The productivity of the ocean increased as the land began to contribute to it. The reefs grew faster, the water richer, the entire biosphere was synchronized, the air feeding the land feeding the sea feeding the air again. The transformation was visible not only in the living world, but in the rock record being written beneath it. Layers of soil rich in organic carbon began to accumulate across the continents. In geological terms, this was a turning point. For the first time, large amounts of biological material were being stored on land rather than in the ocean. This carbon sink helped regulate global temperatures for the rest of Earth's history. The land was no longer just a surface. It had become part of the planet's metabolism. The expansion of plants also affected light itself. The sunlight reaching the ground was filtered, no longer harsh and direct. It created gradients of shade that shaped future evolution. Organisms began to adapt to different levels of brightness, giving rise to new visual systems and behaviors. The interplay of light and life became one of the central forces of evolution, shaping everything from photosynthesis to sight. The green canopy that began here would one day define entire ecosystems, but its roots were in the soft, low plants of the Silurian. If you could walk through one of these landscapes, it would feel strangely quiet but deeply alive. The ground would be soft and damp, covered in mats of moss and thin stems, swaying gently in the wind. Tiny arthropods would move through the undergrowth, their shells catching the light. The air would be humid, carrying the faint scent of wet soil and vegetation. Streams would wind between patches of plants, their surfaces reflecting the shifting colors of the sky. It would be a world of subtle motion. Nothing loud, nothing sudden, but full of energy waiting to unfold. In this new green earth, time itself seemed to slow. Growth was measured in seasons now, not tides. Plants followed the rhythms of sunlight and rainfall rather than the pull of the moon. The biological clocks of the planet had changed. The oceans still breathed in daily cycles, but the land breathed in longer ones, days, months, years. The passage of time had found new meaning in the patterns of roots and leaves. This period marked the beginning of feedback loops that would sustain life indefinitely. More vegetation led to more oxygen, which supported more animals, which enriched the soil, which supported more vegetation. The system reinforced itself. It was the first self-sustaining biosphere on land, the prototype of all future ecosystems. The Earth had entered a phase of permanent vitality. Even now, the traces of this awakening remain. The limestone formed by Silurian reefs still holds the carbon that plants drew from the air. The oxygen that filled the atmosphere then is still part of our air today. The cycles established in that age continue without pause. Rain falling, rivers flowing, soil forming, plants growing. Nothing that began then has truly ended. The continuity is unbroken. The Silurian may not be as famous as the eras that followed, but it was the hinge on which everything turned. It was the time when the planet learned how to connect its parts, how air could shape water, how water could shape rock, how life could shape all three. The green that began then was not just a color, it was a function, a mechanism, a way of keeping the world alive. When you look at the Earth now, at forests stretching across continents, at grasslands rippling under wind, at the deep emerald of river valleys seen from above, you are looking at the legacy of that moment. The color that defines our planet is the memory of the Silurian. Every tree, every leaf, every blade of grass carries within it the echo of that first green, the one that spread slowly over stone while the ocean shimmered below. The Earth was no longer just a planet with life. It had become a living planet. Its air, its soil, its seas and its stone were bound together in continuous exchange. From this point onward, every change, every extinction, every evolution, every climate shift would occur within a system already alive. The biosphere had become inseparable from the planet itself. The awakening was complete, and yet, in another sense, it was still beginning. The world was far from finished. The forests of the Devonian were waiting, the insects, the amphibians, the great ecosystems of the Carboniferous and beyond, all of them would rise from this foundation. The Silurian was the first breath of a new kind of Earth, one capable of supporting endless variation, endless resilience, endless life. Somewhere in a shallow valley beneath a humid sky, a patch of moss caught the morning light. It spread its spores into the air, carried by a breeze that had once moved across a barren world. The wind took them farther than before, scattering them across damp soil where they landed and grew. It was nothing remarkable, just another day in an age of small, persistent change. But in that quiet, unobserved moment, the Earth turned fully green.